Welcome, wanderer of the wasteland, to a journey through broken promises and missed opportunities. Tonight we explore not the triumphs of post-nuclear storytelling, but the fractures in Amazon's adaptation of our beloved Fallout universe. Settle into the darkness as we examine each crack in the foundation, every deviation from sacred lore, and the ways corporate ambition corrupted the purity of the wasteland's vision. Let the rhythm of critique carry you into contemplative rest as we dissect what went wrong when Hollywood tried to capture lightning in a bottle and produced only synthetic thunder echoing through empty vaults. In the beginning, there was war, not the sanitized conflict of noble heroes against mustache-twirling villains, but the grinding, senseless machinery of human violence that reduces civilization to ash and transforms survivors into something both more and less than human. This is the foundation upon which the Fallout universe was built, a meditation on the cyclical nature of destruction, the persistence of human folly, and the terrible beauty that emerges from atomic fire. Yet Amazon's adaptation has transformed this profound examination of war's eternal nature into something far more pedestrian and infinitely more dangerous to the soul of the franchise we hold dear. The original Fallout presented us with a world where war had not simply happened once and ended, but where war continued to happen in new forms, with new weapons, driven by the same fundamental flaws in human nature that had always existed. The Great War of 2077 was not an aberration, but an inevitability, the logical conclusion of a species that had learned to split atoms, but not to split the difference between competing ideologies. In this world, the phrase "war never changes" carried weight that pressed down upon every conversation, every choice, every moment of apparent peace, like the threat of another mushroom cloud blooming on the horizon. But the television adaptation has stripped this philosophy of its power, reducing it to a catchphrase delivered with the gravitas of a movie trailer voiceover, rather than the weight of universal truth. Where the games presented war as a fundamental aspect of human existence that persists regardless of technology, politics, or circumstances, the show treats it as something that can be solved, prevented, or eliminated through the right combination of heroic action and moral clarity. This transformation represents not merely a misunderstanding of the source material, but a fundamental corruption of everything that made Fallout philosophically significant. The games understood that war manifests in countless forms throughout the post-nuclear wasteland. The conflict between the New California Republic and Caesar's Legion was war. The Brotherhood of Steel's hoarding of technology, while wastelanders died of thirst, was war. The systematic oppression of ghouls and super mutants was war. Every territorial dispute, every resource conflict, every moment when humans chose violence over cooperation continued the cycle that had begun with the first rock thrown in anger and would end only with the last human drawing their final breath. War was not an event, but a state of being. Not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be endured. And perhaps, with wisdom and sacrifice, temporarily mitigated. The television show, however, presents war as something imposed upon basically good people by obviously evil forces. Vault-Tech's corporate conspiracy becomes the source of all conflict, as if removing this single malevolent influence would somehow transform human nature and create lasting peace. This approach reveals a profound misunderstanding of what made Fallout philosophically sophisticated. The games never suggested that war was caused by evil people making evil choices, but rather that war emerged naturally from the interaction of competing interests, limited resources, and human psychology shaped by millions of years of evolution in a harsh and unforgiving world. Consider how the original Fallout treated the Master and his Unity movement. Here was an antagonist who genuinely believed he was saving humanity by transforming everyone into super mutants, eliminating the differences that had historically led to conflict. His methods were horrific, his logic was flawed, but his motivation was fundamentally altruistic. He wanted to end war by creating a world where war was impossible. This moral complexity forced players to confront uncomfortable questions about whether peace justified any price, whether unity was worth the loss of diversity, whether the master might actually be right about human nature, requiring fundamental change to achieve lasting harmony. The show, by contrast, presents Vault-Tec as straightforwardly evil, motivated by profit and control rather than any genuine desire to improve the human condition. While this makes for clearer heroes and villains, it also eliminates the moral ambiguity that made Fallout's ethical landscape so compelling. When the source of conflict is obviously evil, the solution becomes obviously good, and the complex moral calculations that define the game's most memorable moments are replaced by simple decisions between right and wrong. This simplification extends to the show's treatment of violence and its consequences. In the games, every act of violence carried moral weight and practical ramifications that extended far beyond the immediate moment of conflict. Killing raiders might protect innocent settlers, but it also perpetuated the cycle of violence that kept the wasteland trapped in its current state. Joining the Brotherhood of Steel might provide access to advanced technology, but it also meant supporting an organization that hoarded resources while wastelanders suffered. Every choice existed within a web of competing moral imperatives that reflected the game's understanding that war emerged from the collision of legitimate but incompatible needs and values. The television adaptation reduces this complexity to spectacle, presenting violence as either justified heroism or unjustified villainy without exploring the deeper currents that drive human conflict. Lucy's journey from pacifist vault dweller to wasteland survivor follows predictable beats that prioritize character development over philosophical exploration. Where game protagonists faced impossible choices that revealed the inadequacy of simple moral frameworks, Lucy encounters situations designed to teach clear lessons about courage, compassion, and the necessity of fighting evil. The show's approach to humor reveals another fundamental misunderstanding of Fallout's philosophical foundation. The games employed dark comedy not as relief from serious themes, but as a method of exploring them more deeply. The juxtaposition of cheerful pre-war advertisements with post-nuclear devastation, the contrast between Vault-Tec's corporate optimism and their horrific experiments, the gap between American idealism and American reality, all serve to highlight the absurdity of human pretensions, while simultaneously mourning what had been lost when those pretensions collided with reality. This satirical edge was not incidental to Fallout's appeal, but central to its identity as a work of art that used science fiction to comment on contemporary society. The games presented a world where American exceptionalism had led directly to global annihilation, where corporate capitalism had commodified human suffering, where technological progress had outpaced moral development with predictably catastrophic results. The humor served to make these critiques palatable while ensuring they retained their sting, creating a tone that was simultaneously entertaining and deeply subversive. The show, however, treats Fallout's humor as flavor text rather than philosophical commentary, using jokes to lighten the mood rather than deepen the meaning. The result is comedy that feels imposed upon the material, rather than emerging naturally from its contradictions and ironies. Where the games used humor to explore the gap between human aspirations and human achievements, the show uses it to provide moments of levity that prevent the audience from dwelling too long on uncomfortable implications. Perhaps most troubling, is how the show's patriotic undertones contradict Fallout's anti-war messaging. The games presented American symbols and slogans with heavy irony, using the iconography of liberty and democracy to highlight how these ideals had been corrupted by militarism and corporate power. The Enclave's obsession with pre-war America was presented as dangerous nostalgia that prevented adaptation to post-war realities. The Brotherhood of Steel's quasi-religious devotion to military technology was shown as fundamentally sterile and ultimately self-defeating. The television adaptation, by contrast, seems to take American iconography at face value, presenting it as something worth preserving and defending rather than critically examining. This shift transforms Fallout from a critique of American militarism into a celebration of American resilience, from a warning about the dangers of technological hubris into a story about good technology defeating bad technology. The philosophical complexity that made the games thought-provoking is replaced by moral clarity that makes the show comforting but ultimately hollow. The original Fallout understood that war never changes not because human beings are inherently evil, but because human beings are inherently human, capable of great love and terrible cruelty, brilliant cooperation and stunning short-sightedness, noble sacrifice and petty selfishness. The games explored how these contradictory impulses played out in a world stripped of the institutions and conventions that normally channeled them into less destructive forms. Every faction, every character, every choice reflected different aspects of human nature, pushed to their logical extremes by circumstances that had no patience for half measures or comfortable compromises. The show reduces this nuanced understanding of human nature to simple categories of good and evil, hero and villain, victim and oppressor. While this makes for clearer storytelling, it also eliminates the philosophical depth that distinguished Fallout from other post-apocalyptic narratives. The result is a work that borrows Fallout's aesthetic and iconography while abandoning the ideas that gave those elements meaning and power. This fundamental misunderstanding of Fallout's core philosophy ripples through every aspect of the adaptation, influencing character development, plot structure, thematic content, and tonal consistency. When the foundation is flawed, everything built upon it becomes unstable, no matter how impressive the construction or how skilled the builders. The show's technical competence and production values cannot compensate for its failure to grasp what made Fallout philosophically significant, leaving us with a beautiful building constructed on a cracked foundation that threatens to bring the entire structure crashing down. In the original vision of Fallout, Vault-Tec Corporation existed as something far more terrifying than simple evil. They were the embodiment of corporate banality, bureaucratic indifference, and the systematic commodification of human suffering, dressed in the cheerful colors of consumer capitalism. Their experiments were not the product of mustache-twirling villainy, but of a mindset that viewed human beings as resources to be optimized, variables to be tested, problems to be solved through the application of scientific method divorced from ethical consideration. This made them genuinely horrifying because their evil was recognizable, institutional, and disturbingly plausible in a world where corporate interests had already begun to supersede human dignity long before the bombs fell. The television adaptation has abandoned this nuanced portrayal in favor of something that would feel at home in a Saturday morning cartoon, transforming Vault-Tec from a complex symbol of institutional evil into a simple conspiracy of obviously malevolent individuals plotting world destruction for profit and power. This transformation represents not merely a simplification of the source material, but a fundamental corruption of everything that made Vault-Tec philosophically significant as antagonists whose evil emerged from systems rather than individuals whose crimes were enabled by ordinary people doing ordinary jobs within extraordinary circumstances. The revelation that Vault-Tec orchestrated the Great War reduces one of science fiction's most compelling examples of systemic failure to a simple story of corporate conspiracy. In the games, the nuclear apocalypse emerged from the collision of resource scarcity, nationalist fervor, technological hubris, and human psychology shaped by millions of years of evolution in a competitive environment. The resource wars that preceded the Great War were not manufactured by any single entity, but grew naturally from the interaction of multiple nations, corporations, and interest groups, each making rational decisions within their own limited perspective that collectively led to irrational outcomes on a global scale. This complexity was essential to Fallout's philosophical foundation because it reflected how real-world catastrophes typically emerge not from the schemes of comic book villains, but from the accumulated weight of countless individual choices made by people who believed they were acting reasonably given the information and incentives available to them. The Great War was terrifying precisely because it was plausible, emerging from recognizable patterns of human behavior, rather than the machinations of an evil organization with inexplicable motivations and unlimited resources. The show's corporate conspiracy narrative eliminates this plausibility by suggesting that nuclear war was the desired outcome of rational actors, rather than the unintended consequence of competing rational actors whose individual rationality produced collective irrationality. This shift transforms the Great War from a cautionary tale about systemic failure into a simple story of good versus evil, reducing the moral complexity that made the original narrative philosophically sophisticated and emotionally resonant. Consider how the games portrayed Vault-Tec's experiments through the lens of corporate efficiency and scientific curiosity rather than explicit malevolence. The Vault Dweller might discover records of the isolation experiment in Vault 12, where researchers observed the psychological breakdown of subjects separated from human contact, but these records were presented as clinical observations rather than sadistic gloating. The horror came not from obvious malice, but from the bureaucratic language that described human suffering in terms of data points and statistical variations, from scientists and administrators who probably considered themselves decent people participating in atrocities, because the institutional structure made individual moral responsibility diffuse and abstract. This approach made Vault-Tec's crimes more rather than less horrifying because it suggested that such atrocities could emerge from ordinary corporate culture taken to its logical extreme. The cheerful optimism of pre-war advertisements juxtaposed with the clinical brutality of experimental protocols created cognitive dissonance that forced players to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between institutional evil and individual responsibility, between systemic incentives and personal choices, between corporate efficiency and human dignity. The television adaptation abandons this subtle horror in favor of scenes where Vault-Tec executives explicitly discuss destroying the world as if they were planning a quarterly earnings report. This approach eliminates the cognitive dissonance that made the original portrayal effective, replacing it with straightforward villainy that allows viewers to distance themselves from the characters and their choices, rather than recognizing how ordinary people might find themselves complicit in extraordinary evil through the war. Simple act of performing their assigned roles within institutional hierarchies designed to obscure moral responsibility. The timeline implications of making Vault-Tec responsible for the Great War create cascading problems throughout the established lore that demonstrate how poorly conceived this narrative choice was from a world-building perspective. If Vault-Tec possessed sufficient power and influence to orchestrate global nuclear war, why did they need to build vaults at all? rather than simply using their control over world governments to achieve their goals through conventional political means. If they controlled multiple nuclear powers with enough precision to coordinate simultaneous attacks, why didn't they demonstrate this control through less destructive means that would have accomplished the same objectives without destroying the infrastructure and resources they presumably wanted to control? The conspiracy narrative requires Vault-Tec to be simultaneously omnipotent enough to manipulate world events and incompetent enough to design experiments that consistently fail to produce useful results, simultaneously prescient enough to predict the specific course of post-war development, and short-sighted enough to create conditions that would actively prevent their own success. The contradiction becomes even more apparent when considering that their supposed goal was to emerge from underground shelters to rebuild civilization according to their vision, yet most of their experimental protocols were designed to kill, corrupt, or psychologically damage the very people they would need as allies and subordinates in their new world order. These logical problems reveal that the conspiracy narrative was constructed to serve dramatic purposes without consideration for internal consistency or plausibility. The writers wanted obvious villains who could be blamed for the world's problems, but they failed to construct a conspiracy that could withstand even casual scrutiny. The result is a plot device that creates more problems than it solves, raising questions that the narrative cannot answer without creating additional contradictions and implausibilities. More troubling is how this revelation undermines decades of carefully constructed lore about the complex geopolitical tensions that led to the resource wars and eventually to global nuclear conflict. The games established that the Great War emerged from competition over increasingly scarce petroleum reserves, exacerbated by the development of fusion technology that promised to revolutionize energy production while simultaneously making traditional energy sources less valuable and the nations that controlled them less powerful. The conflict between the United States and China was driven by rational calculations about national survival in a world where energy scarcity threatened the foundations of industrial civilization. This backstory was compelling because it reflected real-world concerns about resource depletion, international competition, and the relationship between energy availability and political stability. Players could understand how the pre-war world had descended into global conflict because the underlying dynamics were recognizable from contemporary international relations, projected forward into a future where current trends had reached their logical conclusion. The resource wars felt inevitable rather than manufactured because they emerged from fundamental scarcities and competing national interests, rather than the schemes of a single malevolent organization. The show's conspiracy narrative replaces this plausible backstory with something that requires viewers to accept that corporate executives would destroy the entire world, including their own families, communities, and business interests, in pursuit of profits that would be meaningless in a post-apocalyptic wasteland where traditional economic systems no longer functioned. This premise is not merely implausible but actively counterproductive from the perspective of anyone who actually understood how corporate power operates in the real world, where influence is accumulated through the preservation and expansion of existing systems rather than their complete destruction. The reduction of Vault-Tec to cartoon villainy also eliminates the ambiguity that made their experiments genuinely disturbing and philosophically significant. In the games, Vault experiments existed on a spectrum from potentially legitimate scientific research conducted under extreme circumstances to obviously unethical procedures that served no apparent purpose beyond satisfying someone's curiosity about human suffering. The player was often left to wonder whether specific experiments represented examples of scientific necessity, military preparation, corporate callousness, bureaucratic incompetence, or simple sadism, and this uncertainty made the discoveries more, rather than less unsettling, because it forced engagement with complex moral questions rather than simple condemnation of obvious evil. Some vault experiments could be rationalized as attempts to solve real problems that post-war survivors might face, such as the effects of prolonged isolation, the challenges of maintaining genetic diversity in small populations, or the psychological impact of living underground for extended periods. Others seem designed to test the limits of human endurance, or the effectiveness of various control mechanisms that might be necessary for maintaining order in confined spaces. Still, others appeared to serve no purpose beyond generating data about human behavior under extreme stress, reflecting the kind of scientific curiosity that had produced valuable knowledge throughout history, while also enabling some of the worst atrocities committed in the name of research. This moral complexity forced players to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between scientific progress and human dignity, between collective benefit and individual rights, between necessary preparation for survival and unnecessary cruelty disguised as research. The ambiguity was not a flaw in the narrative, but a feature that reflected the genuine difficulty of making moral judgments about actions taken under extreme circumstances by people operating within institutional frameworks that obscured the ethical implications of their choices. The show's approach eliminates this ambiguity by presenting Vault Tech as straightforwardly malevolent, motivated by nothing more complex than greed and power lust expressed through elaborate schemes that serve no rational purpose. This simplification makes their crimes less rather than more horrifying because it allows viewers to dismiss them as the actions of obviously evil people rather than recognizing how institutional structures and cultural values might enable ordinary people to participate in extraordinary atrocities, while maintaining their self-image as decent, rational actors pursuing legitimate goals. The corporate conspiracy narrative also reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of how institutional evil operates in the real world, where the worst atrocities typically result from systems rather than schemes, from ordinary people following institutional incentives and cultural norms, rather than extraordinary people pursuing explicitly malevolent goals. The Holocaust was not orchestrated by a secret society of cartoon villains plotting world domination, but emerged from the interaction of bureaucratic efficiency, ideological commitment, social conformity, economic incentives, and individual careerism within institutions that made participation seem normal, necessary, and even virtuous, while making resistance seem abnormal, dangerous, and morally questionable. Vault Tech's original portrayal captured this dynamic by presenting their experiments as the product of corporate culture taken to its logical extreme, where human beings became data points in pursuit of scientific knowledge, competitive advantage, and institutional survival. The horror came not from the discovery that secretly evil people were doing obviously evil things, but from the recognition that normal corporate dynamics could produce inhuman results when operating within extreme circumstances and, unconstrained by external oversight, public accountability, or ethical frameworks that prioritized human dignity over organizational efficiency. The show's conspiracy narrative transforms this systemic critique into individual villainy, suggesting that the problem was not corporate culture, institutional incentives, or cultural values, but simply the presence of bad people in positions of power who made bad choices for bad reasons. This shift eliminates the philosophical depth that made Vault Tech effective as social commentary, while also reducing their effectiveness as antagonists, because cartoon villains are less threatening than institutional evil that ordinary viewers might recognize in their own lives, workplaces, and social environments. The portrayal of pre-war corporate culture in the show also suffers from this oversimplification, presenting Vault-Tech's board meetings as gatherings of obviously sinister individuals plotting obvious evil rather than exploring how corporate culture might gradually normalize increasingly problematic behavior through incremental boundary violations, institutional pressure, competitive dynamics, and the slow erosion of ethical standards in pursuit of organizational objectives that seem legitimate when considered in isolation from their cumulative effects. The real horror of corporate evil comes not from secret conspiracies hatched in shadowy boardrooms, but from public policies that prioritize profit over people while maintaining the fiction of ethical behavior through legal compliance, public relations management, and the systematic externalization of costs onto communities and individuals who lack the power to resist or demand compensation. This kind of evil is more disturbing than cartoon villainy, because it operates in plain sight, often with public approval, justified by appeals to economic necessity, technological progress, and the greater good. The show could have explored how Vault-Tech's experiments might have been justified to the people who implemented them through appeals to scientific necessity, national security, corporate survival, or the advancement of human knowledge in preparation for post-war reconstruction. Researchers might have convinced themselves that their work was essential for ensuring the survival of human civilization, that the suffering they caused was regrettable but necessary, that their experiments would ultimately save more lives than they cost by providing crucial information about human adaptation to extreme environments. Instead, the show presents Vault-Tech employees as straightforwardly evil, eliminating the moral complexity that would have made their crimes more disturbing and their motivations more psychologically realistic. This approach not only reduces the philosophical sophistication of the narrative, but also eliminates opportunities for viewers to examine their own complicity in institutional systems that prioritize efficiency, profit, and organizational success over individual welfare and moral considerations. The conspiracy narrative also creates problems for future storytelling because it suggests that all post-war problems can be traced back to a single source that could theoretically be eliminated or reformed through the defeat of the remaining conspirators. If Vault-Tech caused the Great War and continues to influence post-war events through their preserved executives and institutional legacy, then addressing the wastelands problems becomes a simple matter of identifying and defeating the bad guys, rather than confronting the systemic issues, cultural values, and human tendencies that enable institutional evil to flourish in any society regardless of its specific political and economic arrangements. This approach reduces the rich complexity of post-war politics to a simple conflict between the good people who oppose Vault-Tech and the bad people who serve their interests, eliminating the moral ambiguity that made faction conflicts in the games philosophically interesting and emotionally compelling. The New California Republic, Caesar's Legion, the Brotherhood of Steel, and other major factions were effective as narrative elements because they represented different approaches to post-war reconstruction, each with legitimate strengths and genuine weaknesses that forced players to make difficult choices about competing values, priorities, and visions of human flourishing. The show's conspiracy narrative threatens to reduce all these conflicts to variations on the theme of resisting or collaborating with Vault-Tech's influence, transforming complex, political, and philosophical disagreements into simple questions of moral alignment that eliminate the need for nuanced thinking about the challenges of building sustainable communities in a world where traditional institutions have collapsed and resources remain scarce. This simplification impoverishes the fictional universe while also eliminating opportunities for the kind of meaningful choice and moral complexity that made the games philosophically sophisticated and emotionally engaging. The Vault Dweller has always been Fallout's most essential archetype, the innocent thrust into a corrupted world, forced to navigate moral complexities that their sheltered upbringing never prepared them to face. This character represents all of us confronting harsh realities that shatter our comfortable assumptions about how the world works, discovering that survival requires choices that challenge everything we believed about right and wrong, good and evil, the nature of human dignity in circumstances where dignity becomes a luxury few can afford. Lucy McLean, the television show's interpretation of this archetype, reduces this profound journey of moral awakening to a collection of tired, fish out of water tropes that transform philosophical complexity into simple character development beats. The original Vault Dweller from the first game embodied the archetype's essential paradox, simultaneously naive and sophisticated, sheltered yet capable, idealistic but pragmatic when circumstances demanded pragmatism. Their journey from vault to wasteland was not merely physical but philosophical, a gradual recognition that the moral certainties of underground life could not survive contact with the moral ambiguities of surface reality. Every choice they made carried weight because it revealed something about what kind of person they would become, what values they would preserve, and which ones they would abandon in pursuit of survival or success or simple peace of mind. Lucy McLean's journey follows a predetermined path that eliminates the uncertainty and moral complexity that made the original archetype compelling. Where game protagonists face choices that could lead them toward heroism or villainy, cooperation or domination, mercy or ruthlessness depending on player decisions and moral priorities, Lucy's development follows Hollywood beats that ensure she will emerge as a fundamentally good person who has learned to be more realistic about the world's dangers without abandoning her essential compassion and moral clarity. This predetermination eliminates the philosophical weight that made Vault Dweller protagonists interesting as vehicles for exploring moral complexity. Their choices mattered because they were genuine choices with real consequences that revealed character rather than simply advancing plot. A player could decide that the wasteland required harsh measures for survival and gradually transform their character into someone who prioritized efficiency over mercy, strength over kindness, results over methods. Alternatively, they could maintain their moral principles despite the costs, accepting suffering and setbacks rather than compromising their values. Discovering whether idealism could survive contact with harsh reality or would prove to be a luxury that few could afford. Lucy's character arc eliminates these possibilities by establishing from the beginning that she is fundamentally good and will remain fundamentally good regardless of what she experiences or what choices she makes. Her corruption is purely cosmetic. She learns to use violence when necessary, becomes more suspicious of strangers, develops survival skills that vault life never required. But her essential moral nature remains unchanged. This approach transforms character development from a process of genuine change into a simple matter of acquiring new skills while retaining core virtues. The show's treatment of Lucy as a Christ figure reveals how thoroughly it has misunderstood what made the Vault Dweller archetype philosophically significant. Her journey through the wasteland becomes a passion play, where her suffering serves to redeem others rather than transform herself. She endures hardships not because the world is genuinely difficult to navigate, but because her goodness must be tested and proven through trials that demonstrate her essential virtue rather than challenging it. This Christ figure interpretation eliminates the moral ambiguity that made Vault Dweller protagonists compelling as characters, rather than simply admirable as moral examples. The original archetype worked because it reflected genuine uncertainty about what survival might require, what compromise might be necessary, what costs might be acceptable, in pursuit of goals that seemed worth pursuing. Players could project their own moral struggles onto characters who faced impossible choices with no clear right answers, discovering through gameplay what values they prioritized when those values came into conflict with each other. Lucy's predetermined goodness eliminates this identification because her choices are predetermined by narrative requirements rather than emerging from genuine moral struggle. Viewers watch her overcome challenges rather than genuinely facing them, observe her, maintain her virtue, rather than questioning whether virtue is always the appropriate response to circumstances that seem designed to punish virtuous behavior and reward pragmatic adaptation to harsh realities. The show's portrayal of Vault psychology demonstrates another fundamental misunderstanding of what made the archetype compelling. In the games, Vault dwellers were not simply naive about surface conditions, but had been shaped by institutional cultures that prioritized different values and encouraged different behaviors than those required for wasteland survival. Vault 13's emphasis on cooperation and collective decision-making created characters who instinctively sought consensus and compromise, even in situations where quick individual action might be more effective. Vault 100 and one's authoritarian structure produced characters who understood hierarchy and obedience, but struggled with independence and self-direction. These psychological differences created genuine obstacles that characters had to overcome through growth and adaptation, rather than simply learning new information about how the outside world functioned. The challenge was not just acquiring new skills, but developing new ways of thinking, new emotional responses, new instinctive reactions to situations that Vault life had never prepared them to handle effectively. Lucy's Vault psychology is purely informational. She knows different facts about the world than surface dwellers do, but her fundamental psychological structure remains identical to theirs once she acquires the relevant knowledge. Her Vault upbringing is treated as a source of naivety rather than a genuinely different approach to understanding and responding to social situations, conflict resolution, resource allocation, and relationship formation. This superficial treatment eliminates opportunities to explore how different social environments shape human psychology in ways that persist long after individuals leave those environments. Real Vault dwellers would carry their institutional conditioning with them into the wasteland, creating internal conflicts between ingrained responses and situational requirements that would be resolved only through extended experience and conscious effort to develop new behavioral patterns. The show's handling of Lucy's optimism reveals another failure to understand the archetype's essential nature. In the games, Vault dweller optimism was not simple cheerfulness, but a fundamental belief in the possibility of positive outcomes that had been preserved by institutional structures designed to maintain hope even in desperate circumstances. This optimism was simultaneously a strength that enabled characters to persevere through difficulties that would break more cynical individuals, and a weakness that left them vulnerable to exploitation by those who understood how to manipulate hopeful expectations. Lucy's optimism feels artificial rather than institutional, a personality trait rather than a worldview shaped by specific experiences and cultural conditioning. Her cheerfulness persists, not because she has been shaped by systems that reinforced positive expectations, but because the narrative requires her to remain fundamentally unchanged by her experiences. This approach eliminates the tension between institutional conditioning and individual adaptation that made Vault dweller protagonists interesting as characters struggling to reconcile competing internal impulses. The comparison to previous game protagonists reveals how thoroughly the show has sanitized the Vault dweller archetype. The lone wanderer from Fallout 3 faced choices that could lead them toward messianic heroism or ruthless pragmatism, with the potential to become either a savior who sacrificed everything for others' benefit, or a survivor who prioritized personal goals over collective welfare. The courier from New Vegas could align with various factions whose competing visions of post-war reconstruction forced players to choose between different conceptions of human flourishing, social organization, and moral priority. These protagonists were compelling because they could develop in multiple directions depending on player choices and moral priorities. Their vault or tribal backgrounds provided starting points for development rather than predetermined endpoints that limited their potential growth. The archetype worked because it reflected genuine uncertainty about what kind of person someone might become when forced to navigate circumstances that their background had not prepared them to handle effectively. Lucy's development follows a single, predetermined path that eliminates this uncertainty and the moral complexity it enabled. Her journey is not one of discovery but of confirmation, not of change but of revelation, not of becoming but of remaining essentially the same, while acquiring new skills and experiences that do not fundamentally alter her character or worldview. The missed opportunity to explore genuine vault psychology becomes particularly apparent when considering how different vault experiments might have shaped their inhabitants' psychological development in ways that would persist long after they left their underground homes. Someone from a vault that practiced mandatory medication might struggle with emotional regulation in its absence. Someone from a vault that eliminated privacy might have difficulty with personal boundaries and individual decision-making. Someone from a vault that encouraged paranoia might see threats everywhere, even when genuine danger was minimal. These psychological legacies would create ongoing internal conflicts that characters would need to resolve through experience and conscious effort, providing opportunities for genuine character development that emerged from the interaction between institutional conditioning and individual agency. The process of adaptation would be genuinely difficult and uncertain, with no guarantee that characters would successfully overcome their conditioning, or that such success would necessarily be beneficial rather than simply different. Lucy's psychological adaptation to the wasteland is too easy and too complete, suggesting that vault conditioning was purely informational rather than deeply ingrained. Her ability to function effectively in surface conditions after minimal experience eliminates the genuine challenges that would face someone whose entire psychological development had occurred within institutional structures designed to encourage very different behavioral patterns and emotional responses. The show's treatment of Lucy's moral journey reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of what made Vault Dweller protagonists philosophically interesting. Their moral development was not a matter of learning to balance idealism with pragmatism, but of discovering what values could survive contact with circumstances that made those values costly or dangerous to maintain. The challenge was not simply becoming more realistic about the world's dangers, but deciding what kind of person they wanted to be when reality made virtue difficult and vice profitable. Lucy's moral journey follows predictable beats that ensure her essential goodness remains intact while she acquires the skills necessary for wasteland survival. Her corruption is purely cosmetic. She learns to use violence when necessary and becomes more suspicious of strangers' motives, but her fundamental moral commitments remain unchanged. This approach eliminates the philosophical weight that made Vault Dweller protagonists interesting as vehicles for exploring moral complexity under extreme circumstances. The predetermined nature of Lucy's character development also eliminates opportunities for viewers to project their own moral struggles onto her journey. Where game protagonists could develop in directions that reflected player values and priorities, Lucy's growth follows narrative requirements that prioritize her essential goodness over genuine moral complexity. This approach makes her admirable as a moral example, but less interesting as a character whose choices reveal something about the relationship between circumstances and character, between external pressures and internal values. The show's failure to capture the complexity of previous Vault Dweller protagonists extends to its handling of the relationship between individual agency and institutional conditioning. The games explored how characters shaped by specific social environments might struggle to adapt to very different circumstances, with success requiring not just acquiring new information, but developing new ways of thinking and responding to situations that their background had not prepared them to handle effectively. Lucy's adaptation to wasteland conditions is too smooth and too complete, suggesting that institutional conditioning can be overcome through simple exposure to different circumstances, rather than requiring extended effort and internal conflict. This approach eliminates opportunities to explore how deeply social environments shape human psychology, and how difficult it can be to change behavioral patterns that were reinforced throughout childhood and adolescence by institutional behavior. Structures designed to encourage specific responses to conflict, resource scarcity, and social interaction. The reduction of Lucy's character to simple archetypes eliminates the moral complexity that made Vault Dweller protagonists compelling as vehicles for exploring philosophical questions about human nature, social organization, and the relationship between individual virtue and collective survival. Her journey becomes a simple story of good triumphing over evil through the application of proper moral principles, rather than a complex exploration of what survival might require when traditional moral frameworks prove inadequate for circumstances their creators never anticipated. The Brotherhood of Steel stands as one of Fallout's most philosophically complex factions, a techno-religious military order that embodies both humanity's greatest achievements and its most dangerous impulses, representing the eternal tension between preserving knowledge and hoarding power, between protecting civilization and controlling it, between noble ideals and fascist implementation. Their complexity lies not in being straightforwardly heroic or villainous, but in being genuinely both simultaneously, their virtues and vices emerging from the same fundamental characteristics that make them simultaneously essential for post-war recovery and dangerous to post-war freedom. The television adaptation has stripped away this complexity in favor of a sanitized portrayal that transforms them into misguided but ultimately redeemable good guys, eliminating the moral ambiguity that made them one of the franchise's most compelling and troubling factions. The original Brotherhood emerged from the ashes of the American military, founded by soldiers who witnessed the horrors that advanced technology could unleash when placed in the hands of people who lacked the wisdom or restraint to use it responsibly. Their mission to preserve and protect pre-war technology was simultaneously noble and self-serving, motivated by genuine concern for preventing another apocalypse, and by elitist assumptions about their own fitness to determine who deserved access to the tools of power. This dual nature made them fascinating as a faction whose members could be simultaneously heroic defenders of civilization and authoritarian gatekeepers who prevented the very progress they claimed to protect. The show's portrayal eliminates this duality by presenting the Brotherhood as fundamentally good people whose methods might sometimes be harsh, but whose intentions are always pure. Their technological hoarding is presented as necessary caution rather than elitist control, their military hierarchy as efficient organization rather than authoritarian structure, their exclusivity as prudent security rather than systematic discrimination. This sanitization removes the moral complexity that made the Brotherhood interesting as a faction whose virtues and vices were inextricably intertwined, whose positive contributions to post-war society came at costs that raised fundamental questions about the relationship between security and freedom, between expertise and democracy, between preservation and progress. Maximus, as a character, embodies everything wrong with the show's approach to the Brotherhood because his development follows Hollywood redemption arc beats rather than exploring the genuine psychological complexity of someone shaped by a military religious cult that combines noble ideals with fascist methodology. His journey from selfish ambition to heroic sacrifice is predetermined by narrative requirements rather than emerging from authentic engagement with the contradictions inherent in Brotherhood ideology and culture. The real Brotherhood of Steel would have shaped Maximus in ways that created genuine internal conflicts between competing impulses, rather than simply teaching him incorrect lessons that could be unlearned through exposure to better moral examples. Someone raised from childhood within their techno-religious hierarchy would have internalized assumptions about technological elitism, military discipline, and social hierarchy that would persist long after he began questioning specific Brotherhood policies or practices. His psychological conditioning would create ongoing struggles between ingrained responses and evolving understanding that could not be resolved through simple moral awakening, but would require extended internal work to overcome patterns established through years of institutional reinforcement. The show's handling of Maximus's motivations reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of how the Brotherhood's ideology would affect someone's psychological development. His desire for power, armor, and recognition is presented as simple personal ambition, rather than the product of a culture that taught him from childhood to measure human worth through technological access and military rank. His jealousy of other Brotherhood members is portrayed as individual character flaws, rather than predictable responses to a system designed to create competition for limited resources and status symbols. This superficial treatment eliminates opportunities to explore how institutional cultures shape individual psychology in ways that persist long after people leave those institutions or begin questioning their teachings. Real Brotherhood conditioning would have taught Maximus to see the world through hierarchical lenses that divided humanity into categories based on technological sophistication, military capability, and ideological purity. These mental frameworks would influence his responses to situations long after he consciously rejected Brotherhood doctrine, creating internal conflicts that could provide genuine character development rather than simple moral education. The Brotherhood's fascist undertones, which the games explored through their technological elitism, military hierarchy, and systematic exclusion of outsiders, are completely absent from the show's portrayal. Where the games presented them as a faction whose noble goals were pursued through methods that raised uncomfortable questions about authoritarianism, technological determinism, and the relationship between expertise and political power, the show presents them as straightforward military organization with admirable discipline and regrettable insularity. This sanitization eliminates one of Fallout's most sophisticated explorations of how fascist movements can attract genuine idealists who believe they are serving noble causes while participating in systems that systematically oppress those deemed unworthy of inclusion. The Brotherhood's combination of technological fetishism, military discipline, and exclusionary ideology created perfect conditions for exploring how ordinary people might find themselves complicit in authoritarian systems that justified oppression through appeals to security, expertise, and the greater good. The show's portrayal of Brotherhood hierarchy as simple military organization rather than techno-religious cult eliminates opportunities to explore how religious and pseudo-scientific ideologies can be used to justify political arrangements that benefit elites while claiming to serve universal principles. The Brotherhood's codex was not simply military regulation, but sacred text that transformed practical policies into moral imperatives, making dissent seem not just insubordinate but heretical, questioning not just wrong but sinful. Maximus's easy acceptance of Brotherhood doctrine and equally easy rejection of it when exposed to alternative perspectives demonstrates the show's failure to understand how deeply institutional conditioning affects psychological development. Someone raised within the Brotherhood's closed system would have internalized their technological elitism as natural law rather than cultural preference, their military hierarchy as divine order rather than political arrangement, their exclusionary practices as necessary protection rather than systematic discrimination. The process of questioning such deeply ingrained assumptions would be genuinely difficult and psychologically painful, requiring not just exposure to different ideas, but fundamental reconstruction of mental frameworks that had shaped understanding of self, society, and moral obligation since childhood. The show's treatment of this process as simple moral education eliminates the genuine complexity of ideological deconversion, while also failing to explore how institutional conditioning might create lasting psychological effects that persist long after conscious beliefs change. The Brotherhood's relationship with technology, which in the games represented a complex mixture of reverence, fear, and desire for control that reflected broader themes about humanity's relationship with its own creations, is reduced in the show to simple military equipment management, where the games explored how technological fetishism could become a substitute for genuine understanding, how the preservation of tools could take precedence over the preservation of the knowledge needed to create and maintain them. The show presents Brotherhood technology as simple military assets rather than objects of quasi-religious devotion. This reduction eliminates opportunities to explore how technological inequality creates and reinforces social hierarchy, how access to advanced tools can become a source of political power that enables those who control technology to dominate those who depend upon it, how the promise of technological solutions can distract from the need for social and political change. The Brotherhood's power armor becomes simple protective equipment rather than a symbol of the technological superiority that justifies their position as wasteland guardians and gatekeepers. The show's portrayal of Brotherhood recruitment and indoctrination demonstrates another failure to understand how the faction would actually function as a social institution. Maximus's background as a child rescued from shady sands should have created complex psychological dynamics around gratitude, loyalty, identity, and belonging that would influence his relationship with the organization throughout his development. Instead, his rescue is treated as simple backstory that explains his presence without exploring how childhood trauma and institutional dependency might shape adult psychology. Real Brotherhood recruitment of traumatized children would create psychological bonds that went far beyond simple gratitude or loyalty, involving dependency, identity formation, and the gradual internalization of institutional values as personal beliefs. The process of separating individual identity from institutional identity would be genuinely difficult and potentially traumatic, requiring not just intellectual rejection of Brotherhood doctrine, but emotional separation from the only family and community the recruit had ever known. The show's handling of Brotherhood internal politics eliminates the factional conflicts and ideological debates that would naturally emerge within any organization attempting to preserve civilization while maintaining exclusive control over the tools necessary for that preservation. Different Brotherhood members would have different ideas about how much technology should be shared with outsiders, what level of military intervention was appropriate for protecting wasteland communities, whether the organization should focus on preservation or expansion of technological capabilities. These internal debates would create opportunities for exploring broader philosophical questions about the relationship between expertise and democracy, security and freedom, preservation and progress through conflicts between Brotherhood members who shared fundamental assumptions about their mission while disagreeing about implementation. Maximus could have been caught between competing Brotherhood factions, rather than simply choosing between Brotherhood loyalty and personal conscience. The absence of these internal conflicts eliminates opportunities to show how institutional cultures can contain multiple perspectives and competing priorities rather than monolithic ideological uniformity. Real organizations, especially those that persist for generations, develop internal complexity that reflects the diversity of human responses to shared circumstances and common challenges. The Brotherhood's portrayal as ideologically uniform eliminates this complexity while also making their eventual reform seem easier than it would actually be. The show's treatment of Brotherhood relationship with outsiders demonstrates another fundamental misunderstanding of how their ideology would affect their interactions with wasteland communities. Their technological superiority would create power imbalances that could not be resolved through simple goodwill or individual virtue, but would require systematic changes in how the organization approached its mission and defined its responsibilities to the people they claim to protect. The games explored how the Brotherhood's paternalistic approach to wasteland protection could be simultaneously beneficial and oppressive, providing security against immediate threats while preventing the kind of technological development that would enable communities to protect themselves. This created moral complexity that forced players to consider whether paternalistic protection was preferable to independence that came with greater vulnerability, whether short-term security justified long-term dependency, whether the Brotherhood's expertise gave them the right to make decisions for communities that lacked their technological capabilities. The show's approach eliminates this complexity by presenting Brotherhood intervention as straightforwardly heroic, with their military superiority providing clear benefits without corresponding costs or moral complications. This sanitization transforms complex questions about paternalism, technological inequality, and the relationship between protection and control into simple stories about good guys helping people against bad guys who threaten them. Maximus's character development could have explored how someone conditioned by Brotherhood ideology might struggle with these moral complexities, gradually recognizing how institutional assumptions about technological elitism and paternalistic protection might conflict with genuine respect for the autonomy and dignity of the people they claim to serve. Instead, his development follows predetermined beats that ensure he will emerge as a conventionally heroic figure whose Brotherhood background provides interesting flavor text rather than ongoing psychological complexity. The show's portrayal of power armor as simple military equipment rather than symbol of Brotherhood identity and superiority eliminates opportunities to explore how material objects can become repositories of meaning that extend far beyond their practical functions. For Brotherhood members, power armor would represent not just protection, but identity, status, connection to pre-war technological achievement, and participation in an elite brotherhood that transcended individual mortality through institutional continuity. Maximus's relationship with power armor should have been psychologically complex, involving not just desire for its practical benefits, but need for the identity and belonging it represented. His eventual willingness to sacrifice it for Lucy's goals could have been genuinely meaningful as a rejection of institutional identity in favor of personal relationships, but the show's failure to establish the armor's psychological significance eliminates this potential depth. The Brotherhood's quasi-religious aspects, which in the games provided fascinating examples of how secular ideologies could take on religious characteristics when they offered meaning, community, and transcendent purpose, are almost entirely absent from the show's portrayal. Their technological fetishism, ritual practices, hierarchical structure, and exclusive access to sacred knowledge created perfect conditions for exploring how religious and pseudo-religious movements emerge from human needs that secular institutions often fail to address. The transformation of practical military procedures into ritual observances, of technological knowledge into sacred wisdom, of organizational hierarchy into divine order, demonstrated how human beings create meaning and transcendence even in circumstances that seem to preclude traditional religious experience. The Brotherhood's techno-religious culture provided community, purpose, and identity for people whose world had been stripped of traditional sources of meaning and belonging. The Ghoul represents one of Fallout's most profound explorations of what it means to be human when humanity itself has been stripped away by radiation, time, and the grinding necessity of survival in a world that has abandoned all pretense of moral order. In the games, ghouls existed as living reminders of the war's lasting consequences, their twisted forms bearing witness to the atomic fire that had consumed the old world, while their extended lifespans forced them to confront centuries of loss, change, and the gradual erosion of everything they had once believed about civilization, progress, and human dignity. The television adaptation has reduced this complex exploration of post-human existence to a simple redemption narrative wrapped around a charismatic performance that substitutes charm for philosophical depth. Cooper Howard's transformation from pre-war movie star to post-war bounty hunter follows predictable Hollywood beats that eliminate the genuine horror and complexity of ghoulification as both physical and psychological process, where the games presented ghoul existence as fundamentally tragic, immortality without peace, survival without purpose, memory without hope of return to better times. The show treats Cooper's condition as an interesting character quirk that provides opportunities for dramatic irony and emotional manipulation, rather than serious engagement with questions about identity, mortality, and what makes existence worthwhile when existence becomes virtually eternal. The original games understood that ghoulification represented more than simple physical transformation, but fundamental alteration of human experience that would affect every aspect of consciousness, relationships, and interaction with the world. Ghouls faced not just discrimination from smoothskins, but the psychological burden of watching everyone they had ever loved age and die while they remained frozen in decaying flesh, accumulating memories of loss that would eventually dwarf any individual human's capacity for grief. Their extended lifespans created unique forms of suffering that the games explored through characters who had witnessed the rise and fall of multiple post-war civilizations, who remembered the old world but could never return to it, who possessed knowledge and experience that made them valuable resources while their appearance made them objects of fear and disgust. Cooper's ghoulification is presented as a straightforward curse that requires periodic medication to prevent him from losing his humanity entirely, reducing the complex psychology of post-human existence to a simple medical condition that can be managed through proper treatment. This approach eliminates opportunities to explore how extended existence might fundamentally alter consciousness, priorities, and relationships in ways that could not be reversed through chemical intervention or moral awakening. The show's treatment of ghoul discrimination demonstrates another failure to understand the deeper implications of post-human existence in post-war society. Smooth-skin prejudice against ghouls was not simply irrational bigotry, but reflected genuine uncertainty about what ghouls had become, whether they retained sufficient humanity to be trusted with the responsibilities and relationships that human communities required for survival and flourishing. The discrimination was still morally wrong, but it emerged from understandable fears about posthuman psychology rather than simple aesthetic revulsion or tribal loyalty. This complexity created opportunities for exploring broader questions about the relationship between physical form and personal identity, between appearance and character, between humanity as biological category and humanity as moral achievement. Ghouls challenged post-war communities to define what made someone deserving of inclusion, protection, and respect, when traditional markers of group membership no longer applied reliably. Their presence forced difficult questions about the foundations of social bonds, moral obligations, and political participation that could not be resolved through simple appeals to tolerance or equality. Cooper's experience of discrimination is presented as straightforward injustice rather than complex social negotiation around posthuman identity and community membership. His suffering becomes fuel for righteous anger rather than opportunity for philosophical exploration of what defines human dignity when human nature itself has been fundamentally altered by circumstances beyond anyone's control or comprehension. The show's portrayal of ghoul culture and society demonstrates perhaps its most significant failure to understand what made ghouls philosophically interesting as posthuman communities that had developed their own approaches to existence, meaning, and relationship, under conditions that human civilization had never anticipated or prepared for. In the games, ghoul settlements like Necropolis and the Underworld represented fascinating experiments in posthuman social organization, where communities bound together by shared transformation rather than shared ancestry had developed unique approaches to governance, resource distribution, and cultural preservation. These communities faced challenges that purely human settlements never encountered: members with dramatically different lifespans, radically altered physical capabilities, and psychological development shaped by centuries of accumulated experience rather than normal human aging patterns. The solutions they developed provided insights into how consciousness, community, and culture might evolve under posthuman conditions, while also exploring what aspects of human social organization were essential to civilization, and which were merely conventional arrangements that could be modified or abandoned without losing what made social life worth preserving. Cooper exists in isolation rather than connection to ghoul communities, eliminating opportunities to explore how posthuman social bonds might differ from human relationships, while also failing to examine how extended existence might affect approaches to friendship, romance, loyalty, and obligation, when timescales become radically asymmetrical between community members with different transformation histories and different expectations about their future existence. The reduction of ghoul existence to individual pathology, rather than collective condition, eliminates the broader social and political implications of posthuman transformation, while also reducing complex questions about identity, community, and meaning to simple problems of personal adaptation and psychological health. Cooper's struggle becomes entirely internal, rather than reflecting broader challenges that posthuman communities would face in defining their relationship to human civilization and their role in post-war reconstruction. The show's handling of Cooper's pre-war memories demonstrates another missed opportunity to explore how extended existence might affect the relationship between past and present, between personal history and current identity, between nostalgia and adaptation to changed circumstances. His memories of the old world serve primarily as plot devices that provide information about Vault-Tech's conspiracy, rather than as psychological burdens that complicate his ability to function in post-war conditions or form meaningful relationships with people who lack his historical perspective. Real ghoul psychology would be profoundly shaped by the accumulated weight of centuries of memory, loss, and change that would make normal human concerns seem trivial, while simultaneously making it difficult to invest emotional energy in relationships or projects that would inevitably be temporary from the perspective of someone expecting to outlive everything they might care about. The tension between accumulated wisdom and emotional exhaustion, between historical perspective and present engagement, between the desire for connection and the knowledge of inevitable loss, would create ongoing internal conflicts that could provide genuine character depth rather than simple backstory exposition. Cooper's emotional development follows conventional patterns that ignore how extended existence might fundamentally alter human psychology, making him essentially a normal person with an unusual appearance and interesting memories, rather than a genuinely posthuman consciousness shaped by centuries of experience that no baseline human could fully understand or relate to. This approach eliminates the alienation and otherness that made ghouls compelling as characters who existed on the margins of human society, not just because of discrimination, but because of fundamental differences in consciousness and experience that could not be overcome through good intentions or moral education. The show's treatment of Cooper's moral journey reflects the same reductive approach that characterizes its handling of other complex elements from the source material. His transformation from heroic movie star to ruthless bounty hunter is presented as straightforward corruption caused by harsh circumstances rather than complex adaptation to posthuman existence under conditions that human moral frameworks were never designed to address effectively. The original games understood that ghoul morality might develop in directions that baseline humans would find difficult to understand or accept, not because ghouls were inherently evil, but because extended existence, under extreme conditions, might require approaches to ethics, relationships, and decision-making that seemed cruel or incomprehensible from normal human perspectives. The accumulation of loss, the weight of historical knowledge, the burden of witnessing repeated cycles of hope and disappointment might naturally lead to emotional detachment, pragmatic calculation, and strategic cruelty that served long-term survival while violating short-term moral intuitions. Cooper's cruelty is presented as psychological damage that could be healed through proper emotional support, rather than as potentially rational adaptation to circumstances that made conventional morality counterproductive or dangerous. His violence serves narrative functions that advance plot and create dramatic tension, rather than exploring how posthuman existence might require fundamentally different approaches to ethics and relationships that could not be judged by standards developed for baseline human experience. The show's handling of Cooper's relationships with other characters demonstrates its failure to explore how posthuman psychology might affect social bonds, emotional investment, and interpersonal dynamics when one party possesses centuries of experience while others operate within normal human timescales and psychological development patterns. His interactions with Lucy and other characters follow conventional relationship beats that ignore how ghoul existence might create fundamental barriers to genuine understanding and connection that could not be overcome through good intentions or shared experiences. The asymmetry between ghoul and human experience would create ongoing challenges for any relationship that attempted to bridge the gap between posthuman and baseline human consciousness. Cooper's accumulated centuries of memory, loss, and adaptation would provide perspective that his human companions could never fully share or understand, while their normal human concerns and emotional responses might seem naive or irrelevant from his posthuman perspective. These differences could create opportunities for exploring how relationships might function across fundamental differences in consciousness and experience. But the show reduces such possibilities to simple dramatic irony, rather than genuine philosophical exploration. The show's portrayal of ghoul physicality also demonstrates its failure to understand how posthuman embodiment might affect consciousness, identity, and social interaction in ways that extended far beyond simple aesthetic differences or medical complications. Ghoul bodies represented fundamental alterations in human relationship to physical existence, immunity to radiation that enabled survival in environments that would kill baseline humans, extended lifespans that changed relationships to time and mortality, altered sensory experiences that might affect perception and consciousness in ways that could not be fully communicated to those who had never experienced such changes. Cooper's ghoul body is treated primarily as visual effect and plot convenience rather than as fundamental alteration in embodied experience that would affect every aspect of consciousness and social interaction. His physical transformation provides dramatic visual impact without exploring how such changes might alter his relationship to sensation, perception, temporality, and spatial experience in ways that would make his consciousness genuinely different from baseline human awareness, rather than simply damaged human psychology in an unusual form. The missed opportunity to explore ghoul sexuality, reproduction, and family formation represents another failure to consider how posthuman transformation might affect fundamental aspects of human experience and social organization. Ghouls faced unique challenges in forming intimate relationships, creating families, and participating in reproductive cycles that sustained post-war communities. But these challenges also provided opportunities for developing alternative approaches to intimacy, kinship, and community that might expand understanding of what human relationships could become under posthuman conditions. Cooper's romantic and sexual relationships are either eliminated entirely or treated as straightforward human dynamics that ignore how ghoul embodiment might create new possibilities for intimacy while also creating barriers to conventional relationship patterns. The show's failure to explore these aspects of posthuman existence eliminates opportunities for examining how consciousness, embodiment, and social bonds might evolve under conditions that human culture had never anticipated or prepared for. The broader implications of ghoul existence for post-war civilization, which the games explored through their complex integration into some communities and exclusion from others, are reduced to simple discrimination narrative that eliminates opportunities for examining how posthuman populations might contribute to or complicate post-war reconstruction efforts. Ghouls possessed unique capabilities, perspectives, and challenges that could benefit post-war communities, while also creating social tensions that required new approaches to governance, resource distribution, and cultural development. Cooper's isolation from these broader social dynamics eliminates opportunities to explore how posthuman communities might participate in post-war civilization, while also maintaining their own distinct cultures, values, and approaches to existence that reflected their unique experiences and capabilities. His individual story becomes disconnected from the larger questions about posthuman society that made ghouls philosophically interesting as posthuman populations, rather than simply individuals with unusual characteristics. The show's treatment of Cooper's ultimate fate and future development suggests that his ghoul existence is primarily obstacle to overcome, rather than condition to explore, that his journey leads toward recovery of baseline human relationships and values, rather than adaptation to posthuman possibilities that might expand rather than simply complicate human existence. This approach eliminates the radical potential that ghoul existence represented in the original games, where posthuman transformation opened new possibilities for consciousness, community, and meaning rather than simply creating problems to be solved through proper treatment or moral education. The Fallout universe was built upon decades of careful world building that created a coherent timeline of pre-war hubris, nuclear devastation, and post-war recovery, punctuated by setbacks, triumphs, and the gradual emergence of new civilizations from the ashes of the old. This timeline was not merely background decoration, but the foundation upon which every story, character, and faction gained meaning through their place in the larger narrative of human survival and adaptation. The television adaptation has taken a sledgehammer to this carefully constructed chronology, creating contradictions and inconsistencies that undermine not just specific plot points, but the entire framework of causation and consequence that made the Fallout universe feel like a living, breathing world where actions had lasting effects and choices mattered across generations. The destruction of Shady Sands represents perhaps the most egregious example of how the show's cavalier approach to established lore creates cascading problems throughout the fictional timeline. In the games, Shady Sands evolved from a small farming community founded by Vault 15 refugees into the capital of the new California Republic, demonstrating how post-war civilization could grow and develop despite ongoing challenges from raiders, mutants, and resource scarcity. This progression was not simply background history, but active demonstration of humanity's capacity for recovery, adaptation, and social evolution under extreme circumstances. The show's decision to destroy Shady Sands with a nuclear weapon eliminates one of the most important success stories in post-war reconstruction, transforming a symbol of human resilience into another example of post-war failure. This destruction serves no narrative purpose beyond creating backstory for Maximus, while simultaneously undermining decades of established continuity that portrayed the new California Republic as an imperfect but fundamentally successful experiment in democratic governance and regional integration. More troubling than the destruction itself is how it affects the timeline of events in Fallout New Vegas, where the new California Republic plays a central role as one of the major factions competing for control of the Mojave Wasteland. The show's chronology suggests that Shady Sands was destroyed before or during the events of New Vegas, which would make the NCR's presence in that conflict impossible, or at least dramatically different from how it was portrayed in the game. This creates fundamental continuity problems that cannot be resolved without either ignoring the show's timeline or drastically reinterpreting established game events. The casual dismissal of New Vegas's narrative significance reveals how poorly the show's creators understood the interconnected nature of Fallout's world building, where each installment built upon previous entries to create an increasingly complex and sophisticated exploration of post-war civilization's development. New Vegas was not simply another game, but the culmination of decades of world building that brought together factions, characters, and storylines from throughout the series to explore fundamental questions about governance, progress, and human nature through the lens of competing civilizations with different approaches to post-war reconstruction. By undermining the new California Republic's established history and development, the show eliminates one of the most important elements of New Vegas's political complexity, while also destroying one of Fallout's most successful examples of how democratic institutions might evolve under post-war conditions. The NCR was not perfect. It struggled with corruption, expansion, resource management, and the tension between democratic ideals and imperial ambitions. But it represented genuine progress toward rebuilding civilized society on a scale that individual settlements could never achieve alone. The show's technological anachronisms reveal another fundamental misunderstanding of how Fallout's world was supposed to work, where the level of technological development and social organization was carefully calibrated to reflect the passage of time since the Great War, while also accounting for the loss of industrial capacity, technical knowledge, and educational institutions that would have slowed recovery and forced survivors to rebuild civilization from much more primitive foundations than their pre-war ancestors had enjoyed. The presence of advanced technology that should not exist given the timeline and circumstances creates an unrealistic portrayal of post-war conditions that eliminates the resource scarcity and technical limitations that made survival challenging and reconstruction slow. When characters have access to sophisticated equipment without explanation of how such items were manufactured, maintained, or acquired, the world stops feeling like a plausible post-apocalyptic environment and starts resembling a theme park where interesting props appear whenever the plot requires them. This technological inconsistency extends to the show's portrayal of various factions and their capabilities, where groups that should be struggling with basic infrastructure and equipment maintenance instead possess military hardware and organizational sophistication that would require industrial bases and educational systems that the post-war world simply could not support at the scale and timeline. The show presents the Brotherhood of Steel, Enclave remnants, and other factions become cartoonish military forces rather than desperate survivors fighting over scarce resources with improvised weapons and jury-rigged equipment. The show's misrepresentation of post-war economics demonstrates another failure to understand how scarcity, trade, and resource allocation would function in a world where traditional supply chains, manufacturing centers, and financial institutions had been destroyed by nuclear war and never fully rebuilt. The games portrayed post-war commerce as a combination of barter, script currencies backed by valuable commodities, and reputation-based credit systems that reflected the challenges of maintaining complex economic relationships without the institutional framework that modern economies require. The television adaptation treats post-war economics as simple backdrop, rather than fundamental aspect of how post-war society would function, eliminating opportunities to explore how communities might develop alternative approaches to resource distribution, trade relationships, and wealth accumulation under conditions where traditional economic assumptions no longer applied. The result is a world that looks post-apocalyptic, but functions according to contemporary economic logic that makes no sense given the supposed level of infrastructure, destruction, and institutional collapse. The simplification of complex political relationships between various factions eliminates much of what made Fallout's world politically interesting, as a collection of competing civilizations with different approaches to governance, expansion, and interaction with neighboring communities. The games portrayed faction conflicts as emerging from genuine disagreements about fundamental questions of political organization rather than simple territorial disputes or resource competition, creating opportunities for exploring different models of post-war governance and their respective strengths and weaknesses. The show reduces these complex political dynamics to simple good versus evil conflicts that eliminate the moral ambiguity and ideological sophistication that made faction choices meaningful in the games. When factions become straightforwardly heroic or villainous rather than representing different approaches to genuine problems with no clear right answers, political conflict becomes simple entertainment rather than philosophical exploration of competing values and priorities under extreme circumstances. The misrepresentation of various settlements and their development eliminates the sense of organic growth and adaptation that characterize successful post-war communities in the games, where players could observe how different environmental conditions, resource availability, and cultural backgrounds produced different approaches to reconstruction that reflected the creativity and resilience of post-war survivors. Each settlement told a story about human adaptation, while also demonstrating specific solutions to survival challenges that other communities might adopt or modify for their own circumstances. The show's settlements feel artificial and temporary, rather than evolved and sustainable, lacking the sense of history and gradual development that made game locations feel like real places where real people had lived, worked, and died while building something worth preserving and defending. This eliminates opportunities to explore how different communities might develop distinct cultures, economies, and social structures based on their specific circumstances and the values of their founders and inhabitants. The show's ignorance of established regional variations in post-war development creates a homogenized wasteland that lacks the geographical and cultural diversity that made different areas of post-war America feel distinct and interesting. The games understood that different regions would recover at different rates and in different ways based on factors like climate, natural resources, pre-war population density, proximity to military targets, and the cultural background of survivors who formed the nucleus of new communities. This regional diversity was not simply aesthetic variation, but fundamental aspect of world building that reflected how different environmental and social conditions would produce different approaches to post-war reconstruction. The West Coast's relatively advanced civilization contrasted meaningfully with the East Coast's more primitive conditions, while the Southwest's unique challenges and opportunities created distinct political and economic arrangements that reflected the interaction between environment and culture under post-war conditions. The television adaptation's decision to set its story in a generically post-apocalyptic wasteland, rather than a specific region with particular characteristics and history, eliminates opportunities to explore how local conditions might affect community development, while also failing to take advantage of the rich geographical and cultural diversity that different regions would offer for storytelling purposes. The result is a world that could be anywhere, and therefore feels like nowhere, lacking the specificity and authenticity that made game locations memorable and meaningful. The show's handling of radiation and its effects demonstrates another fundamental misunderstanding of how nuclear contamination would function in the post-war world, where different areas would have different levels of radioactive hazard based on their proximity to ground zero, prevailing wind patterns during fallout distribution, local geography that might concentrate or disperse contamination, and the passage of time since the original bombardment. These variations created interesting gameplay challenges, while also providing logical explanations for why some areas remained dangerous, while others became habitable again. The television adaptation treats radiation as a simple plot device rather than environmental factor that would fundamentally shape post-war geography, settlement patterns, trade routes, and survival strategies. When radiation appears and disappears according to dramatic convenience, rather than following logical patterns based on established physics and geography, the world stops feeling like a coherent environment and becomes an arbitrary collection of hazards and resources, arranged for entertainment purposes, rather than logical consequences of nuclear war and subsequent recovery efforts. The show's portrayal of mutations and their effects on post-war ecology eliminates much of the biological complexity that made Fallout's mutated creatures interesting as examples of how life might adapt to radioactive environments, rather than simply dying out or remaining unchanged. The games portrayed mutation as a double-edged sword that could produce both beneficial adaptations and harmful deformities, creating new ecological relationships, while also disrupting established ones in ways that survivors would need to understand and adapt to for successful long-term settlement. The reduction of mutated creatures to simple monsters eliminates opportunities to explore how post-war ecosystems might function differently from pre-war ones, how new species might fill ecological niches left vacant by extinct pre-war animals, how human communities might need to develop new approaches to agriculture, hunting, and resource management based on changed environmental conditions that required different strategies from those that had worked before the war. The show's treatment of pre-war artifacts and their significance demonstrates another failure to understand how the relationship between past and present would function in post-war society, where pre-war technology, knowledge, and cultural artifacts would be simultaneously precious resources and dangerous temptations that could distract communities from developing sustainable approaches to post-war life. The games explored this tension through various factions' different relationships to pre-war heritage, from the Brotherhood's technological fetishism to tribal communities' selective adoption of useful pre-war innovations while rejecting harmful pre-war values. The television adaptation treats pre-war artifacts as simple plot devices rather than complex symbols of the relationship between progress and destruction, preservation and adaptation, nostalgia and innovation that would shape how post-war communities understood their place in history and their responsibilities to future generations. When pre-war technology appears without consideration of how it might affect social dynamics, economic relationships, and cultural development, opportunities for exploring deeper themes about tradition, innovation, and cultural continuity are lost in favor of simple treasure hunt narratives. The show's casual disregard for established character backgrounds and development eliminates connections between different installments that created sense of continuity and consequence across the franchise, where actions taken in earlier games had lasting effects that appeared in later installments as evidence that choices mattered, and the world continued to evolve based on player decisions and established storylines. This interconnectedness was not simply fan service, but fundamental aspect of world building that created sense of living, breathing universe, where events had consequences that extended beyond immediate narrative requirements. When characters, factions, and communities appeared in multiple games with their histories intact and their development continuing logically from previous appearances, players could feel that their choices and actions contributed to ongoing story that was larger than any individual installment. The show's approach eliminates this sense of continuity and consequence by treating established lore as optional background rather than foundational framework that gives meaning to current events. When characters and factions can be altered or eliminated according to dramatic convenience without regard for their established roles in the larger narrative, the world becomes an arbitrary collection of interesting elements, rather than coherent universe with internal logic and historical development. The implications of these lore contradictions extend far beyond simple continuity errors to undermine the philosophical coherence that made Fallout meaningful as exploration of human nature, social organization, and moral choice under extreme circumstances. When the world's history becomes arbitrary and its development follows dramatic convenience rather than logical consequence, the moral weight of choices diminishes, and the exploration of competing values and priorities loses its grounding in realistic cause and effect relationships. The post-nuclear wasteland of Fallout was never simply a backdrop for adventure, but a living, breathing world where every rusted car, every crumbling building, every makeshift settlement told stories of survival, adaptation, and the gradual emergence of new forms of civilization from the ashes of the old. Each location possessed its own history, its own culture, its own approach to the challenges of post-war existence, creating a tapestry of human resilience that demonstrated both the diversity of possible responses to catastrophe and the common threads of hope, determination, and ingenuity that connected disparate communities across vast distances and ideological differences. The television adaptation has replaced this rich, lived-in world with a sterile theme park version of post-apocalyptic existence that prioritizes visual spectacle over authentic detail, dramatic convenience over logical development, surface aesthetics over the deeper storytelling that made Fallout's environments integral to its philosophical exploration of human nature under extreme circumstances. The original games understood that the wasteland was not simply a collection of interesting locations, but an ecosystem of interconnected communities whose relationships with each other created the political, economic, and social dynamics that drove larger narratives about post-war reconstruction and the competing visions of human civilization that different factions represented through their actions rather than their rhetoric. Settlements like Hub, Junktown, and Necropolis in the original Fallout were not just quest destinations but functioning communities with their own internal politics, economic systems, and cultural practices that reflected different approaches to post-war survival and demonstrated how local conditions, available resources, and the values of founding populations could produce radically different social arrangements within the same general geographical area. These communities felt authentic because they had been designed to solve real problems that post-war survivors would face: where to find clean water, how to produce food without industrial agriculture, how to maintain security against raiders and mutants, how to establish trade relationships that would provide access to goods and services that individual settlements could not produce independently, how to resolve disputes without established legal systems, how to preserve knowledge and culture while adapting to radically changed circumstances that made many pre-war practices obsolete or impossible to maintain. The television show's settlements lack this sense of organic development and practical purpose, appearing instead as carefully designed sets that exist primarily to serve narrative functions rather than demonstrating how real communities might actually function under post-war conditions. They feel temporary and artificial, lacking the accumulated history and gradual adaptation that would characterize genuine post-war communities that had survived long enough to establish themselves as permanent fixtures in the post-nuclear landscape, rather than temporary camps or way stations for travelers moving between more important destinations. The absence of established communities and their complex relationships eliminates much of what made Fallout's world politically and economically interesting as a network of interdependent settlements whose cooperation and conflict created the larger patterns of post-war civilization. In the games, players could observe how trade routes developed between communities with complementary resources and capabilities, how military alliances formed to address common threats, how cultural exchange spread innovations and ideas across vast distances, how political disputes over resources, territory, and ideology created conflicts that could escalate into regional wars or be resolved through diplomacy and compromise. This network of relationships created a sense of scale and continuity that made the wasteland feel like a real place where human communities were engaged in the ongoing project of rebuilding civilization rather than simply surviving from day soul. Today, without larger goals or connections to the broader world beyond their immediate vicinity. When settlements existed in isolation from each other, opportunities for exploring themes of cooperation, competition, cultural development, and political organization were eliminated in favor of simple survival narratives that reduced post-war existence to individual struggle rather than collective endeavor. The show's Wasteland lacks the sense of historical depth that made game environments compelling as archaeological sites where careful observation could reveal stories about what had happened in specific locations during the war, in the immediate aftermath, and during the long process of recovery and adaptation that had followed. Environmental storytelling in the games allowed players to piece together narratives about how different areas had been affected by the war, what kinds of communities had emerged in different locations, how those communities had succeeded or failed in their attempts to establish sustainable ways of life under post-war conditions. This storytelling approach created a sense of discovery and investigation that rewarded careful attention to environmental details, while also demonstrating how the past continued to influence the present through the physical remnants of pre-war civilization, the traces of post-war adaptation efforts, and the ongoing processes of decay and renewal that shaped the landscape in ways that reflected both natural forces and human intervention over the decades since the bombs fell. The television adaptation's environments feel static and decorative, rather than dynamic and meaningful, lacking the layered history that would accumulate in real places where multiple generations of post-war survivors had lived, worked, and died while attempting to create something worth preserving and defending. When locations exist primarily to look interesting rather than to tell stories about human adaptation and resilience, opportunities for deeper exploration of themes about continuity, change, memory, and hope are lost in favor of simple visual impact that impresses viewers without engaging their imagination or intellectual curiosity. The show's misrepresentation of post-war civilization's progress and regression creates an unrealistic portrayal of how human societies would develop under post-nuclear conditions, where recovery would be uneven, intermittent, and vulnerable to setbacks that could destroy decades of progress in a matter of days or hours. The games portrayed post-war development as fragile and uncertain, with communities that seemed successful and stable potentially facing collapse due to resource depletion, leadership failures, external threats, or internal conflicts that revealed underlying weaknesses in their social organization or economic foundations. This fragility was not simply dramatic convenience, but realistic reflection of how difficult it would be to rebuild complex civilization without the industrial base, educational institutions, and accumulated capital that had enabled pre-war society to achieve unprecedented levels of technological sophistication and social organization. Post-war communities would need to solve fundamental problems of survival and security before they could invest resources in education, research, cultural development, and the other activities that enable civilization to advance beyond mere subsistence-level existence. The television show's approach to post-war development eliminates this sense of fragility and uncertainty by presenting communities that seem either completely primitive or surprisingly advanced, without demonstrating the gradual processes of accumulation, innovation, and institutional development that would be necessary for sustained progress under post-war conditions. When settlements appear to have capabilities that exceed what their apparent resources and population could support, the world stops feeling like realistic post-apocalyptic environment and becomes fantasy setting where interesting things happen according to dramatic requirements rather than logical consequences of established circumstances. The show's ignorance of the established timeline of recovery and development creates chronological inconsistencies that undermine the sense of historical progression that gave meaning to different installments in the game series, where later games could demonstrate how the world had evolved since earlier entries, while also exploring how different regions had developed along different trajectories based on their specific circumstances and the choices made by their inhabitants over time. This temporal framework was essential for creating sense of ongoing narrative, where actions had lasting consequences and choices made in earlier time periods continued to influence later developments in ways that players could observe and understand. When the timeline becomes arbitrary and development follows dramatic convenience rather than logical progression, the sense of living world with its own history and momentum is replaced by simple backdrop that changes according to story requirements rather than internal dynamics and established patterns of cause and effect. The reduction of complex post-war politics to simple conflicts eliminates opportunities to explore how different approaches to governance, resource allocation, and social organization might emerge under post-war conditions, as communities experimented with various solutions to the challenges of maintaining order, promoting prosperity, and defending themselves against external threats while also preserving the values and cultural practices that made their existence meaningful, rather than merely sustainable. The games portrayed political complexity through factions that represented genuinely different philosophies of post-war reconstruction, each with legitimate arguments about the best path forward, and genuine weaknesses that created vulnerabilities to criticism and opposition. The new California Republic's democratic ideals were accompanied by bureaucratic inefficiency and imperial overextension. Caesar's legion's military effectiveness was coupled with authoritarian brutality and cultural stagnation. The Brotherhood of Steel's technological preservation was undermined by elitist isolation and paternalistic control over resources that other communities desperately needed. These political complexities created meaningful choices for players who had to decide which flaws they could tolerate and which virtues they valued most highly. When no faction offered perfect solutions to the challenges of post-war existence, the television show's approach eliminates this complexity by presenting factions as straightforwardly good or evil, rather than exploring how different approaches to genuine problems might each offer advantages and disadvantages that would appeal to different people based on their values, experiences, and priorities. The absence of regional variation and unique cultural developments creates homogenized wasteland that lacks the geographical and cultural diversity that would naturally emerge as different areas recovered from the war under different conditions and developed distinct approaches to post-war existence based on local resources, environmental challenges, population composition, and historical circumstances that would vary significantly across the vast expanse of post-war America. The games understood that different regions would develop different cultures, economies, and political systems based on factors like climate, natural resources, proximity to pre-war population centers, exposure to different types of radiation and mutation, and the cultural background of surviving populations who formed the nucleus of new communities. These regional differences were not simply aesthetic variation, but fundamental aspects of world building that reflected how local conditions would influence community development in ways that created authentic diversity rather than arbitrary decoration. The West Coast's relatively advanced recovery reflected its distance from some major military targets and the presence of vault tech facilities that had preserved populations with technical knowledge and organizational skills. The East Coast's more primitive conditions resulted from heavier bombing and the absence of major vault experiments that preserved large populations. The Southwest's unique challenges created distinct political arrangements that reflected the interaction between harsh environmental conditions and the cultural practices of surviving tribal populations. This regional authenticity created sense of real world with genuine geographical and cultural diversity, rather than theme park with different themed areas that existed primarily to provide visual variety for entertainment purposes. When regions feel like actual places with their own histories and characteristics, rather than arbitrary collections of interesting elements, opportunities for exploring themes about adaptation, cultural development, and the relationship between environment and society become available that would be impossible in more generic settings. The show's failure to capture the environmental storytelling that made game locations memorable and meaningful eliminates one of Fallout's most distinctive and effective narrative techniques, where careful observation of environmental details could reveal complex stories about what had happened in specific places during the war, in the immediate aftermath, and during the long process of recovery that had followed over the decades since the bombs fell. A rusted playground with scattered toys told stories about the children who had played there before the war and never returned. A pre-war advertisement for consumer goods, juxtaposed with post-war scavenging operations, revealed the gap between pre-war abundance and post-war scarcity. A carefully maintained shrine in a bombed-out church demonstrated how spiritual needs persisted even under the most desperate circumstances. A fortified settlement built around a pre-war gas station showed how survivors had adapted existing infrastructure to serve new purposes, while preserving useful elements from the old world. These environmental narratives created emotional connections between players and locations, while also demonstrating broader themes about loss, adaptation, continuity, and hope without requiring explicit exposition or heavy-handed symbolism. The television show's environments lack this narrative density, serving primarily as backdrops for character interactions rather than active participants in storytelling that could communicate complex ideas about post-war existence through visual details that rewarded careful attention, thoughtful interpretation. The elimination of the game's unique atmosphere of melancholy hope mixed with dark humor creates tonal inconsistencies that undermine the philosophical coherence that made Fallout's world emotionally compelling as well as intellectually interesting. The games achieved remarkable balance between despair and optimism, between humor and horror, between nostalgia for the lost past and excitement about possible futures that reflected the complex emotional landscape that post-war survivors would navigate as they attempted to rebuild their lives and communities under circumstances that offered both unprecedented challenges and unprecedented opportunities. This emotional complexity was not simply aesthetic choice, but fundamental aspect of the human experience under extreme circumstances, where survivors would simultaneously grieve for what had been lost and celebrate what remained, fear future threats while hoping for better times, remember past joys while adapting to present realities that required new approaches to relationships, work, meaning, and community that could not simply replicate pre-war patterns, but would need to serve post-war needs and possibilities. The show's approach to tone eliminates this emotional complexity in favor of more conventional dramatic structures that prioritize clear emotional beats over the ambiguous mixture of feelings that would characterize genuine post-war experience. When tone becomes simple rather than complex, opportunities for exploring the full range of human responses to catastrophe and recovery are lost in favor of more predictable emotional journeys that feel familiar rather than authentic, comforting rather than challenging, simple rather than true to the complexity of human experience under extraordinary circumstances. The world the television show presents feels empty despite its production values because it lacks the accumulated human presence that would characterize any environment where communities had been established long enough to create the cultural institutions, economic relationships, and social traditions that transform mere survival into genuine civilization. Real post-war settlements would show evidence of multiple generations of human habitation, with architectural modifications that reflected changing needs and capabilities, cultural artifacts that demonstrated the evolution of local traditions and values, and economic infrastructure that supported trade relationships and specialized production beyond simple subsistence activities. This absence of human depth makes the wasteland feel like museum exhibit rather than living environment where real people had invested their lives in creating something worth preserving and defending. When locations exist primarily to serve narrative functions rather than demonstrating authentic human adaptation to post-war conditions, the world becomes stage set rather than genuine place where meaningful stories about survival, community, and hope could unfold naturally, rather than being imposed through dramatic convenience and visual spectacle. Violence in the original Fallout games carried weight that extended far beyond the immediate moment of conflict, creating ripple effects that forced players to confront the true cost of choosing force over diplomacy, revenge over mercy, expedience over principle in a world where every act of aggression contributed to cycles of retaliation that had already consumed civilization once and threatened to do so again. The games understood that violence was not simply a tool for solving problems, but a fundamental force that shaped communities, relationships, and individual psychology in ways that could not be easily undone through good intentions or moral awakening after the damage had been done. Each violent encounter carried moral weight because it represented a choice between competing values: immediate effectiveness versus long-term consequences, personal survival versus collective welfare, justified retaliation versus breaking cycles of revenge that had already claimed too many lives and would continue claiming more unless someone chose to pay the price of restraint. The television adaptation has transformed this complex moral landscape into mindless spectacle that treats violence as entertainment rather than tragedy, eliminating the psychological and social consequences that made combat in the games emotionally resonant and philosophically significant. Where the games forced players to confront the human cost of their choices through the faces of those they killed, the reactions of those who witnessed their actions, and the long-term effects of their decisions on communities and relationships, the show presents violence as visually impressive action sequences that serve dramatic purposes, without exploring the deeper implications of choosing force over alternative solutions to conflict. This transformation reduces the profound moral complexity that made Fallout's approach to violence unique among post-apocalyptic narratives, which typically either glorified combat as heroic necessity or condemned it as unmitigated evil, without exploring the grey areas where real moral decisions occurred. The games occupied the uncomfortable middle ground where violence was sometimes necessary, sometimes counterproductive, and always costly in ways that extended beyond immediate tactical considerations to affect the kind of person the player character became and the kind of world they helped create through their accumulated choices over time. The show's action sequences prioritize spectacle over substance, creating visually impressive combat that lacks the emotional weight and moral complexity that made violence in the games feel consequential rather than simply entertaining. When characters engage in firefights, hand-to-hand combat, or explosive destruction, the focus remains on choreography, special effects, and dramatic tension, rather than exploring what such encounters cost the participants psychologically, morally, and socially in ways that would affect their future relationships and decision-making processes. This approach eliminates opportunities to examine how violence affects both perpetrators and victims in ways that extend far beyond physical injury, to include psychological trauma, moral corruption, social disruption, and the gradual erosion of empathy and human connection that occurs when people become accustomed to solving problems through force rather than negotiation, compromise, or mutual understanding. The games explored these consequences through character development systems that tracked player choices and reflected them in dialogue options, faction, relationships, and narrative outcomes that demonstrated how violent solutions created new problems, even when they successfully addressed immediate threats. The television show's treatment of death as reversible entertainment rather than permanent loss eliminates the finality that made violent choices meaningful in the games, where killing another person meant permanently removing them from the world, along with all their potential contributions, relationships, and possibilities for growth or redemption. When characters die without leaving lasting impact on the narrative or other characters' development, violence becomes casual rather than consequential, reducing human beings to expendable props, rather than recognizing them as irreplaceable individuals whose loss diminishes everyone who knew them. The games understood that every death in the wasteland represented not just the end of one person's story, but the elimination of knowledge, skills, relationships, and possibilities that could never be recovered or replaced. The mechanic of permanent character death forced players to consider whether their goals justified such irreversible costs, whether their methods were proportionate to their objectives, whether alternative approaches might achieve similar results without requiring permanent solutions to temporary problems. This permanence created emotional investment in combat outcomes, while also encouraging players to explore non-violent alternatives whenever possible, not from abstract moral principles, but from practical recognition that violence created losses that could not be undone through subsequent good behavior or moral awakening. The show's casual approach to death eliminates this emotional weight, while also reducing opportunities for exploring themes about loss, grief, responsibility, and the value of human life. Under circumstances where life had already become tragically cheap, but still retained fundamental dignity that deserved protection and respect. The transformation of Fallout's dark humor into simple brutality demonstrates another fundamental misunderstanding of how the games used comedy to explore serious themes rather than simply providing relief from dramatic tension. The original games employed gallows humor as coping mechanism for characters living under impossible circumstances, while simultaneously highlighting the absurdity of human pretensions and the gap between noble ideals and harsh realities that post-war existence made impossible to ignore. This humor served philosophical purposes by revealing contradictions between what people claimed to value and how they actually behaved, when those values came into conflict with survival needs, personal ambitions, or tribal loyalties that trumped abstract moral principles. When resources became scarce and choices became desperate, the comedy emerged naturally from these contradictions, rather than being imposed upon the material for entertainment purposes, creating opportunities for both laughter and reflection about human nature under extreme circumstances. The show's approach to humor lacks this philosophical depth, using violence as setup for jokes rather than using comedy to explore the deeper implications of violent behavior in ways that might illuminate something meaningful about human psychology, social dynamics, or moral reasoning under post-war conditions. When humor becomes simple rather than complex, opportunities for using comedy as a tool for social criticism and philosophical exploration are lost in favor of entertainment that distracts from serious themes rather than helping audiences engage with them more effectively. The glorification of wasteland justice and revenge eliminates the moral ambiguity that made player choices in the games genuinely difficult and emotionally resonant. The concept of justice in post-war society raised fundamental questions about authority, legitimacy, proportionality, and the difference between individual revenge and community protection that could not be answered through simple appeals to traditional moral frameworks that assumed institutional support and social stability that no longer existed in recognizable forms. When established legal systems had collapsed, and new ones had not yet developed sufficient authority or capability to address serious crimes, individuals and communities faced impossible choices between accepting injustice and taking law into their own hands in ways that might provide immediate satisfaction, but also establish dangerous precedents for resolving future conflicts. Through force, rather than negotiation, arbitration, or other methods that might preserve community cohesion and prevent cycles of retaliation from destroying fragile social bonds. The games explored these dilemmas through scenarios where players had to decide whether to pursue personal vengeance against those who had wronged them, whether to support community efforts to establish justice systems that might be imperfect but offered alternatives to endless cycles of revenge, whether to accept losses and focus on building better futures, rather than correcting past wrongs through methods that might perpetuate the very problems they sought to solve. The show's approach eliminates this complexity by presenting revenge as straightforwardly justified and personally satisfying, without exploring the broader social implications of choosing individual justice over community healing, immediate satisfaction over long-term stability, emotional release over practical problem-solving that might address underlying causes rather than simply punishing visible symptoms of deeper systemic issues. The absence of meaningful choice in moral situations transforms passive consumption of predetermined narratives into something fundamentally different from the interactive moral engagement that made the games philosophically significant as opportunities for exploring ethical reasoning under extreme circumstances. When players made choices about whether to kill, spare, help, or abandon other characters, they were forced to examine their own values and priorities in ways that pure entertainment could not achieve. This interactive element was essential to the game's moral impact because it required active participation in ethical decision-making rather than simply observing how fictional characters resolved moral dilemmas according to predetermined scripts. The process of choosing between competing alternatives and living with the consequences created opportunities for genuine moral reflection that extended beyond the gaming experience into real-world thinking about ethics, responsibility, and the relationship between individual choices and collective outcomes. The television show's approach eliminates this participatory element by presenting predetermined solutions to moral problems rather than exploring the reasoning processes that might lead different people to different conclusions based on their values, experiences, and priorities. When moral complexity becomes passive entertainment rather than active engagement, opportunities for genuine ethical education and personal growth are lost in favor of simple consumption of pre-digested moral lessons that require no intellectual effort or emotional investment from audiences. The show's violence serves spectacle rather than narrative purpose, existing primarily to create dramatic tension and visual excitement rather than advancing character development, exploring philosophical themes, or demonstrating the real costs of choosing force over alternative approaches to conflict resolution. When combat becomes choreographed entertainment rather than meaningful consequence of character choices and moral reasoning, opportunities for deeper engagement with questions about justice, mercy, necessity, and proportionality are eliminated in favor of simple action sequences that provide temporary excitement without lasting impact on viewers' understanding or emotional development. This approach reduces violence to consumer product rather than moral choice, eliminating the weight and consequence that made combat in the games feel significant rather than trivial, meaningful rather than arbitrary, connected to larger themes about human nature and social organization, rather than simple obstacle to overcome through superior firepower or tactical planning that required no engagement with ethical considerations or long-term consequences. The missed opportunity to explore trauma and its lasting effects eliminates one of the most important aspects of how real violence affects real people, in ways that extend far beyond immediate physical injury to include psychological damage, social disruption, and spiritual crisis that can persist for years or decades after the original traumatic events have ended. The games touched on these themes through character backgrounds, dialogue options, and narrative elements that suggested how pre-war and post-war violence had shaped individual psychology and community development in ways that continued to influence behavior and relationships long after specific conflicts had been resolved. Post-war survivors would carry psychological scars from witnessing or participating in violence that would affect their ability to form trusting relationships, engage in cooperative activities, or maintain optimistic outlooks about human nature and social possibilities. These effects would not be simple character quirks, but fundamental aspects of consciousness that would require ongoing attention and support to prevent from undermining individual mental health and community cohesion over time. The show's failure to address these psychological realities creates unrealistic portrayal of post-war existence that eliminates opportunities for exploring how communities might develop approaches to healing, support, and rehabilitation that would be necessary for maintaining social bonds and individual well-being under circumstances where traditional therapeutic institutions and practices would not be available in familiar forms. The absence of long-term consequences for violent actions eliminates the sense of accumulating moral weight that made player choices in the games feel significant beyond immediate tactical considerations. When characters could kill dozens of people without experiencing lasting effects on their psychology, relationships, or social standing, violence became mechanically rather than morally significant, reducing complex ethical decisions to simple resource management problems that could be solved through superior planning and execution rather than moral reasoning and emotional engagement with the human costs of choosing force over alternatives. The game's reputation systems, faction relationships, and character development mechanics created ongoing consequences for player choices that demonstrated how individual actions contributed to larger patterns of behavior that shaped personal identity and social relationships in ways that could not be easily reversed through subsequent good behavior or moral awakening. This created incentives for careful consideration of violent options, while also providing meaningful feedback about the cumulative effects of choosing force over diplomacy, revenge over mercy, expedience over principle in situations where such choices had lasting implications for both individual development and community welfare. The television show's elimination of these consequence systems transforms violence into simple entertainment rather than moral exploration, reducing opportunities for audiences to engage with questions about responsibility, justice, mercy, and the relationship between individual choices and collective outcomes that made the games philosophically significant as well as entertaining. The show's approach to wasteland survival eliminates the resource scarcity and equipment degradation that made every violent encounter in the games a calculated risk involving ammunition costs, weapon maintenance, injury treatment, and opportunity costs that forced players to consider whether combat was worth the investment of scarce resources that might be needed for other purposes. When violence becomes cheap rather than expensive, incentives for exploring alternative solutions to conflict are eliminated in favor of direct approaches that prioritize immediate effectiveness over long-term sustainability. This economic dimension of violence was not simply gameplay mechanic, but realistic reflection of how resource limitations would affect decision-making under post-war conditions, where every bullet, every stim pack, and every piece of equipment represented investment that could not be easily replaced if lost or damaged during combat encounters. The game's emphasis on resource management created natural incentives for avoiding unnecessary violence, while also making necessary violence feel consequential rather than trivial. The show's elimination of these practical constraints makes violence feel arbitrary rather than calculated, reducing opportunities for exploring how resource limitations might encourage cooperation, negotiation, and other approaches to conflict resolution that required less investment of scarce materials, while potentially achieving better long-term outcomes for all parties involved in disputes. The irony inherent in Amazon's adaptation of Fallout represents one of the most perfect examples of corporate cognitive dissonance in modern entertainment history. A multinational conglomerate worth hundreds of billions of dollars adapting source material that explicitly critiques corporate power, technological hubris, and the commodification of human suffering, while apparently remaining completely oblivious to how their own position as global corporate hegemon undermines every anti-capitalist message they attempt to convey through their sanitized version of post-nuclear storytelling. The original games were built upon a foundation of skepticism toward corporate authority, technological solutions to social problems, and the concentration of power in institutions that prioritized efficiency and profit over human dignity and democratic participation. Yet Amazon has transformed this critique into entertainment product that serves the very corporate interests. The source material was designed to challenge and subvert. The sanitization of Fallout's anti-capitalist messaging begins with the fundamental decision to transform complex systemic critique into simple moral melodrama, where evil corporations can be defeated by heroic individuals rather than examining how corporate logic inevitably corrupts institutions regardless of the personal virtue of those who operate within them. The games understood that Vault-Tech's crimes emerged not from the personal evil of specific executives, but from structural incentives that rewarded quarterly profits over long-term human welfare, competitive advantage over ethical behavior, shareholder value over social responsibility, in ways that made atrocities inevitable rather than accidental byproducts of otherwise legitimate business practices. This structural analysis was essential to the game's philosophical sophistication because it recognized that corporate evil was not aberration that could be corrected through better leadership or stricter regulation, but predictable outcome of systems designed to maximize financial returns, while externalizing social and environmental costs onto communities and individuals who lacked the power to demand compensation or prevent exploitation. The critique was not directed at capitalism as abstract economic theory, but at actually existing corporate capitalism as practiced by institutions that had accumulated sufficient power to operate beyond democratic oversight or market accountability. Amazon's adaptation eliminates this structural critique by presenting corporate evil as individual moral failure rather than systemic problem, suggesting that Vault-Tech's crimes resulted from bad people making bad choices rather than normal people operating within institutional frameworks that incentivized harmful behavior while punishing ethical resistance to corporate priorities. This transformation allows viewers to condemn obvious villains while avoiding uncomfortable questions about their own complicity in supporting corporate systems that prioritize profit over people through their consumption choices, emploiement décision, and political participation in societies where corporate interests have captured regulatory agencies and legislative processes. The show's production context reveals the deeper irony of how corporate media creates entertainment that appears to criticize corporate power while actually reinforcing it through the very process of transforming critique into commodity that can be consumed without requiring any change in viewer behavior or social organization. Amazon's investment in high production values, celebrity casting, and elaborate marketing campaigns demonstrates how corporate resources can be used to create apparently subversive content that actually serves corporate interests by channeling dissatisfaction with existing systems into harmless entertainment consumption rather than political action or economic resistance. This process of commodification transforms genuine critique into simulation of critique that provides emotional satisfaction without practical consequences, allowing audiences to feel virtuous about consuming anti-corporate messages, while continuing to support the corporate systems that those messages ostensibly challenge. The psychological effect is to reduce political consciousness to consumer choice, suggesting that watching the right television shows or buying the right products constitutes meaningful resistance to corporate power, rather than simply different forms of participation in the same system under different branding strategies. The transformation of anti-corporate source material into corporate product also demonstrates how cultural hegemony operates through the absorption and neutralization of dissent, rather than its direct suppression, creating illusion of ideological diversity while ensuring that all permitted viewpoints remain within boundaries that do not threaten fundamental power relationships or economic arrangements that benefit corporate elites. Amazon's willingness to fund apparently anti-capitalist entertainment reveals confidence that such content will not inspire genuine resistance to corporate authority, but will instead provide safety valve that redirects political energy into consumption activities that reinforce rather than challenge existing power structures. The show's approach to political themes reflects the broader pattern of how corporate media handles potentially subversive material by extracting its revolutionary potential while preserving its entertainment value, creating products that feel edgy and politically engaged, while avoiding any content that might inspire audiences to examine their own relationship to corporate power or consider alternatives to consumer capitalism as organizing principle for social and economic life. This selective appropriation allows corporations to profit from anti-corporate sentiment, while ensuring that such sentiment does not develop into actual anti-corporate action. The target audience considerations that shape the show's political content reveal how market research and demographic analysis can be used to ensure that potentially challenging material is presented in ways that maximize broad appeal while minimizing genuine ideological confrontation with corporate values and priorities. The decision to emphasize individual heroism over systemic analysis, moral melodrama over political complexity, and redemption narratives over revolutionary critique reflects calculated choices about what kinds of anti-corporate messages can be safely commercialized without threatening corporate interests or inspiring audience members to examine their own complicity in supporting systems they claim to oppose. This market-driven approach to political content creates entertainment that appears to take bold stances while actually avoiding any position that might alienate significant portions of potential consumers or advertisers who might object to genuinely subversive material that challenged fundamental assumptions about property rights, democratic participation, or the legitimacy of corporate authority in areas like healthcare, education, housing, and environmental protection. where corporate interests directly conflict with human welfare and ecological sustainability. The sanitization process also involves the elimination of class-based analysis that might encourage audiences to understand their own economic relationships as forms of exploitation rather than voluntary exchange, their own political powerlessness as a result of systemic disenfranchisement rather than individual failure, their own environmental degradation as consequence of corporate externalization rather than personal consumption choices that could be addressed through better individual decisions within existing market frameworks. The show's failure to address real-world corporate power in meaningful ways reflects broader patterns in contemporary entertainment, where political content is permitted only insofar as it can be contained within individualistic frameworks that locate responsibility for social problems in personal moral choices rather than institutional structures, technological decisions, or economic arrangements that might be changed through collective action rather than consumer behavior or electoral participation within systems designed to limit meaningful political choice to options that do not threaten corporate passive interests. The transformation of satire into sincere heroic narrative eliminates the ironic distance that allowed the original games to critique American exceptionalism, technological optimism, and corporate benevolence without becoming preachy or heavy-handed in their political messaging. The game's satirical approach allowed players to discover political themes through gameplay experience, rather than having them imposed through explicit dialogue or narrative exposition, creating opportunities for genuine political education through interactive engagement with systems that demonstrated how institutional incentives produced harmful outcomes, regardless of individual intentions. The television show's sincere approach eliminates this ironic sophistication by presenting political themes as explicit moral lessons rather than implicit systemic critiques, reducing opportunities for audience members to develop their own political understanding through critical engagement with complex material that required active interpretation rather than passive consumption of predetermined political messages that confirmed existing beliefs rather than challenging them through exposure to alternative perspectives or uncomfortable truths about power relationships. The show's heavy-handed approach to political messaging also reflects corporate media's tendency to treat audiences as consumers rather than citizens, assuming that political content must be simplified and emotionally manipulated rather than presented in ways that respect audience intelligence and encourage independent, critical thinking about complex social issues that require nuanced understanding rather than simple emotional responses to obvious moral conflicts between clearly defined good and evil forces. This condescending approach to political education eliminates opportunities for genuine consciousness raising that might inspire audience members to examine their own political beliefs, economic relationships, and social responsibilities in ways that could lead to meaningful changes in behavior, political participation, or economic choices that might actually challenge corporate power, rather than simply providing emotional satisfaction through consumption of apparently rebellious entertainment that actually reinforces existing power relationships through the very process of its creation and distribution. The loss of Fallout's genuine subversive edge reflects broader patterns in how corporate media co-opts and neutralizes political dissent by appropriating its aesthetic and rhetorical elements while eliminating its practical implications and revolutionary potential. The process transforms authentic critique into performance of critique that provides psychological benefits of political engagement without requiring any actual political action or economic sacrifice that might threaten corporate interests or challenge audience members' comfortable position within existing systems of exploitation and environmental destruction. This co-optation is particularly effective because it allows both corporate producers and consumer audiences to maintain illusions of political virtue while participating in systems that directly contradict the values they claim to support through their entertainment choices. The psychological function is to reduce cognitive dissonance between political beliefs and economic behavior by providing consumption opportunities that appear to align with stated values while actually supporting the very systems those values supposedly oppose. The broader implications of this sanitization process extend beyond individual entertainment products to encompass the entire cultural industry's role in maintaining political stability through the management of dissent rather than its suppression, creating illusion of ideological diversity, while ensuring that all permitted viewpoints remain within boundaries that do not threaten fundamental power or relationships or economic arrangements that benefit corporate elites at the expense of democratic participation, economic justice, and environmental sustainability. The success of this approach demonstrates how sophisticated corporate power has become in managing political opposition through cultural hegemony rather than direct repression, creating systems that appear to tolerate and even encourage political dissent while actually channeling it into forms that reinforce rather than challenge existing power structures through the very process of their expression and consumption within corporate-controlled media environments. The Amazon adaptation's treatment of technology as simple plot device rather than complex social force eliminates opportunities to explore how technological development under corporate control serves elite interests rather than human needs, how innovation is directed toward profitable applications rather than socially beneficial ones, how technological solutions to social problems often create new forms of exploitation and control rather than genuine liberation from oppressive conditions that require political rather than technological solutions. This technological determinism serves corporate interests by suggesting that social problems result from inadequate technology rather than inequitable power relationships, that solutions can be achieved through better products rather than better political organization, that progress occurs through market mechanisms rather than democratic participation in decisions about how technological capabilities should be developed and deployed for human benefit rather than corporate profit. The show's failure to examine how corporate control of technology development shapes both the direction of innovation and the distribution of its benefits reflects broader patterns in corporate media, where technological optimism is promoted as alternative to political action, suggesting that corporate-controlled technological development will eventually solve social problems that actually require democratic control over economic institutions and technological priorities that currently serve elite interests, rather than human welfare. The political implications of Amazon's Fallout adaptation extend beyond entertainment into broader questions about cultural production under corporate capitalism, where the apparent diversity of available content masks fundamental uniformity in political perspective that serves elite interests, while providing illusion of ideological choice that prevents genuine political alternatives from gaining cultural influence or popular support that might translate into political action or economic resistance. The success of corporate cultural hegemony depends on creating entertainment that feels politically diverse, while actually reinforcing fundamental assumptions about market economics, technological progress, and individual responsibility that prevent collective action or systemic analysis from developing into genuine threats to corporate power or consumer capitalism as organizing principle for social and economic life. The greatest tragedy of Amazon's Fallout adaptation lies not in what it chose to include, but in what it chose to ignore. The vast treasure trove of established lore, compelling characters, and sophisticated storylines that decades of game development had created, each offering opportunities for television storytelling that could have honored the source material while also providing rich dramatic content that served both longtime fans and newcomers to the franchise. Instead of drawing upon this accumulated wealth of narrative possibilities, the show's creators chose to invent original storylines and characters that possessed none of the depth, complexity, or thematic resonance that made Fallout philosophically significant as exploration of human nature, social organization, and moral choice under extreme circumstances that tested every assumption about civilization, progress, and the possibility of learning from past mistakes. Consider the untapped potential of the Master's story from the original Fallout, a narrative that could have provided television drama of unprecedented philosophical sophistication, while also delivering the kind of body horror and psychological complexity that modern audiences have demonstrated their appetite for through the success of programs that explore transformation, identity, and the question of what makes someone human when humanity itself becomes mutable rather than fixed category. The Master represented one of science fiction's most compelling examples of how good intentions could lead to monstrous outcomes, how rational analysis of human problems could produce solutions that eliminated the very humanity they were designed to preserve. His transformation from Richard Gray, idealistic scientist seeking to help humanity survive the post-war wasteland, into the Master, grotesque fusion of multiple consciousness, convinced that forced evolution into super-mutant collective represented the only path to lasting peace, offered opportunities for exploring themes about identity, sacrifice, the relationship between individual consciousness and collective welfare, and the terrible seduction of totalitarian solutions to complex social problems that democratic societies struggle to address through messier but more humane processes of negotiation and compromise. The visual possibilities alone, the gradual revelation of what Gray had become, the horror and tragedy of his physical transformation, the psychological journey from human individual to post-human collective consciousness would have provided stunning television that served both dramatic and philosophical purposes while remaining true to the source material's sophisticated approach to questions about human nature, technological transcendence, and the price of utopian ambitions that prioritized abstract ideals over concrete human relationships and individual dignity. The show could have explored how the Master's Unity movement attracted followers not through deception but through genuine appeal to people who had witnessed the failures of human societies to achieve lasting peace, prosperity, or security in the post-war world. His arguments were not obviously wrong. Human diversity had indeed led to conflict. Competition had indeed produced waste and suffering. Individualism had indeed prevented the kind of cooperation that post-war survival seemed to require for long-term success and stability. This moral complexity would have forced viewers to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between diversity and conflict, individual freedom and collective welfare, democratic messiness, and authoritarian efficiency that could not be resolved through simple appeals to conventional wisdom about good and evil. The Master's defeat would have required not just military victory, but intellectual and moral arguments that demonstrated why human diversity was worth preserving despite its costs, why individual freedom was worth protecting despite its dangers, why, democratic chaos was preferable to totalitarian order despite its inefficiencies. The story of Harold and his transformation from human survivor to living ecosystem offers another example of how the show could have explored posthuman themes with greater sophistication and emotional resonance than its superficial treatment of Cooper Howard's ghoulification. Harold's gradual transformation from wasteland wanderer to immobile tree man, forced to serve as reluctant deity for tribal communities, demonstrated how post-war existence might create entirely new forms of consciousness and social relationship that challenged traditional boundaries between individual and community, human and nature, mortality and permanence. His story provided opportunities for examining how communities might develop religious and spiritual practices around genuinely transcendent experiences, rather than simple projections of pre-war beliefs onto post-war circumstances. The tribes that worshipped Harold as God were not simply primitive peoples clinging to superstition, but rational actors responding to genuine miracle, a being who could provide healing, wisdom, and continuity across generations, while also serving as living symbol of how life could triumph over death, growth over destruction, hope over despair in ways that abstract theology could never match. The television adaptation could have explored how Harold's unwilling divinity created genuine moral dilemmas about consent, responsibility, and the obligations that extraordinary individuals might have toward ordinary communities that depended upon their unique capabilities for survival and meaning. His desire for death conflicted with his followers' need for his continued existence, creating philosophical tension between individual autonomy and collective welfare that could not be resolved through simple moral formulas, but required careful consideration of competing values and interests. The political complexity of New Vegas offered perhaps the greatest missed opportunity for sophisticated television storytelling that could have honored the source material while also providing the kind of morally ambiguous character, development, and factional conflict that modern audiences have. Embraced in programs like Game of Thrones, The Wire, and other series that present complex political situations without clear heroes or villains, the conflict between the New California Republic, Caesar's Legion, and independent Vegas, under House's leadership, represented genuinely different approaches to post-war reconstruction, with legitimate arguments and serious weaknesses that defied simple moral categorization. The NCR's democratic ideals were undermined by imperial overstretch, bureaucratic corruption, and the tendency of democratic institutions to serve organized interests rather than general welfare when citizens became too numerous and distant for direct participation in governance. Caesar's Legion offered efficiency, security, and cultural unity at the cost of individual freedom, gender equality, and intellectual development that might be necessary for long-term adaptation to changing circumstances. House's technocratic vision provided stability and progress through benevolent dictatorship that eliminated democratic participation while preserving personal freedom within boundaries established by algorithms rather than human deliberation. These competing visions could have provided seasons of television content that explored fundamental questions about governance, legitimacy, representation, and the relationship between individual liberty and collective welfare, through character-driven narratives that demonstrated how abstract political principles played out in concrete human relationships and practical policy decisions that affected real people's lives in measurable ways. The courier's role as independent agent whose choices determined the outcome of these conflicts offered opportunities for exploring how individual decisions could have historical consequences, while also examining how personal, moral, Development occurred through engagement with complex political situations that required characters to choose between competing goods rather than simply selecting obvious right answers to clear moral questions. The show's failure to explore established communities like Vault City, New Reno, or The Hub eliminated opportunities for demonstrating how different post-war societies had developed unique approaches to governance, economics, and social organization based on their specific circumstances, available resources, and cultural heritage that reflected both continuity with pre-war traditions and adaptation to post-war realities that required innovative solutions to unprecedented challenges. Vault City's xenophobic technocracy demonstrated how pre-war technology could be preserved and developed, while also showing how technological superiority could become justification for social hierarchies that violated democratic principles and human dignity. New Reno's casino-based economy revealed how pre-war vice industries could provide foundation for post-war prosperity, while also creating social problems that stable communities would need to address through regulation, taxation, or alternative economic development that served broader community interests. The Hub's Merchant Republic illustrated how trade relationships could create prosperity and cultural exchange, while also demonstrating how commercial interests might conflict with other community values like environmental protection, social equality, or democratic participation in economic decision-making that affected entire populations rather than simply individual consumers and producers operating in theoretical free markets. These communities offered rich material for exploring how different values and priorities produced different social arrangements, while also examining how communities adapted their institutions over time in response to changing circumstances, internal contradictions, and external pressures that required ongoing negotiation between competing interests and evolving understanding of what made community life sustainable and worthwhile. The show could have addressed contemporary social issues through Fallout's post-war lens in ways that provided fresh perspectives on current problems, while also remaining true to the source material's approach to social criticism through speculative fiction that projected current trends into future scenarios where their implications became more visible and their consequences more dramatic than they appeared in present circumstances. Environmental degradation, economic inequality, technological displacement of human labor, the concentration of political power in corporate institutions, the breakdown of democratic norms, and civic engagement. All of these contemporary concerns were present in Fallout's world in exaggerated forms that could provide opportunities for examining their causes and potential solutions without the ideological baggage that made direct discussion of current issues politically polarizing and emotionally charged. The post-war setting provided natural laboratory for exploring alternative approaches to social organization that might address current problems through institutional innovations that were difficult to imagine within existing political and economic frameworks, but became plausible when traditional institutions had been destroyed and survivors were forced to create new arrangements from first principles based on practical necessity rather than ideological commitment to existing systems. The show's safe choices created generic post-apocalyptic television that borrowed Fallout's aesthetic elements while abandoning the philosophical sophistication that distinguished it from other entries in the genre. The decision to prioritize broad appeal over thematic depth eliminated opportunities for creating genuinely distinctive entertainment that could have attracted audiences precisely because it offered something different from conventional television rather than simply providing familiar, dramatic structures dressed in post-nuclear costume design and production values. The missed potential for genuine social commentary reflects broader patterns in contemporary entertainment, where political content is sanitized to avoid alienating potential consumers rather than being used to challenge audience assumptions, provoke genuine thought about complex issues, or inspire meaningful engagement with questions about social organization, moral responsibility, and individual agency that might lead to personal growth or political action, beyond passive consumption of entertainment products. The show could have explored themes of community building, resource management, environmental restoration, and social justice through storylines that demonstrated how these challenges played out in concrete situations with real human consequences, rather than abstract theoretical discussions that remain disconnected from lived experience and practical application. The post-war setting provided opportunities for showing rather than telling how different approaches to these issues produce different outcomes for real people trying to build meaningful lives under difficult circumstances. The failure to examine how trauma affects individuals and communities across generations eliminated opportunities for addressing contemporary concerns about historical injustice, intergenerational inequality, and the long-term effects of violence on social development in ways that could provide insights into current debates about reparations, restorative justice, and the responsibility that present communities have for addressing past wrongs that continue to affect current conditions. The show's approach to technology as simple plot device rather than social force missed opportunities to explore how technological development could serve human needs rather than corporate profits, how communities might democratically control technological priorities rather than accepting market-driven innovation, how alternative approaches to research and development might produce different kinds of technological capabilities that enhanced human flourishing, rather than simply increasing economic productivity or military capability. The better understanding of the games that could have improved every aspect of the show would have begun with recognition that Fallout's appeal came not from its post-apocalyptic setting, but from its sophisticated approach to exploring human nature, social organization, and moral choice through interactive storytelling that required players to engage actively with complex ethical questions, rather than passively consuming predetermined moral lessons delivered through conventional dramatic structures. This interactive element could not be directly translated to television, but its spirit could have been preserved through storytelling approaches that respected audience intelligence, presented genuinely complex moral situations without obvious right answers, and trusted viewers to develop their own understanding of characters and themes through careful observation and critical thinking, rather than explicit exposition and heavy-handed moral instruction. The show's creators missed the opportunity to create television that honored both the source material and the medium by developing approaches to adaptation that preserved the philosophical sophistication of the games, while also taking advantage of television's unique capabilities for character development, visual storytelling, and serialized narrative that could explore themes over extended time periods, rather than compressing them into individual episodes or game sessions. The success of Amazon's television adaptation creates a dangerous precedent that threatens to fundamentally alter the trajectory of future Fallout game development, as corporate executives and marketing departments interpret high viewership numbers and positive mainstream reception as validation of the show's simplified approach to the franchise's themes, characters, and world-building philosophy. This commercial success may convince decision-makers that audiences prefer straightforward moral narratives over complex ethical exploration, that they respond better to individual heroism than systemic critique, that they want comfortable entertainment rather than challenging philosophical engagement with questions about human nature, social organization, and the price of survival under extreme circumstances that made the original games intellectually sophisticated as well as entertaining. The risk of future games moving toward the show's interpretation rather than honoring the established lore and thematic complexity becomes particularly acute when considering how modern game development increasingly operates according to transmedia franchise logic that prioritizes consistency across different media platforms over the unique strengths and requirements of individual formats. When television adaptations achieve mainstream success that exceeds the cultural impact of their source material, pressure mounts to align future game content with the more popular interpretation, regardless of whether that interpretation serves the interactive medium effectively or preserves the philosophical sophistication that made the franchise culturally significant beyond its entertainment value. This pressure manifests not through explicit mandates from corporate executives, but through the subtle influence of market research, focus group testing, and demographic analysis that guides development decisions toward approaches that seem likely to replicate the television show's commercial success, rather than exploring the unique possibilities that interactive storytelling offers for engaging players in complex moral reasoning and philosophical reflection that passive media consumption cannot achieve regardless of its production values or narrative sophistication. The concern extends beyond simple creative influence to encompass fundamental questions about artistic integrity and cultural preservation when corporate interests prioritize market expansion over thematic coherence, when the desire to attract new audiences leads to the abandonment of elements that made the original work meaningful to existing fans, who appreciated its complexity and were willing to engage with challenging content that required active, intellectual participation rather than passive emotional consumption of predetermined moral lessons delivered through conventional, dramatic structures. The show's success demonstrates how simplified interpretations of complex source material can achieve broader commercial appeal, precisely because they eliminate the challenging aspects that might alienate casual consumers who prefer entertainment that confirms existing beliefs, rather than questioning fundamental assumptions about morality, politics, and human nature under circumstances that test conventional wisdom and comfortable prejudices about how individuals and communities should respond to existential threats and resource scarcity. This dynamic creates perverse incentives for future content creators who may conclude that commercial success requires the elimination of moral ambiguity, philosophical complexity, and political sophistication in favor of clear heroes and villains, simple moral lessons, and reassuring narratives about human resilience and the ultimate triumph of good over evil that provide emotional satisfaction without intellectual challenge or genuine engagement with difficult questions about survival, justice, and the relationship between individual virtue and collective welfare under extreme circumstances. The potential for adaptation success to influence game development becomes particularly problematic when considering how the interactive medium's unique strengths, player agency, moral choice, systemic consequences, and emergent storytelling could be compromised by attempts to replicate television's linear narrative structures and predetermined character arcs that eliminate the uncertainty and personal investment that made player choices meaningful as expressions of individual values and moral reasoning rather than simple selections from predetermined menu options. The transformation of player agency into predetermined narrative paths would eliminate one of the most philosophically significant aspects of the Fallout experience, where individual choices about violence, cooperation, resource distribution, and political alignment created opportunities for genuine moral education through interactive engagement with complex ethical scenarios that had no obviously correct solutions and required players to examine their own values and priorities in ways that passive entertainment consumption could never achieve. This concern becomes more acute when considering how modern game development increasingly relies on narrative designers and writers who may be more familiar with television and film storytelling conventions than with the unique requirements of interactive narrative design that must account for player agency, multiple possible outcomes, and the need for systemic coherence across branching storylines that reflect different moral choices and philosophical approaches to post-war reconstruction and community building. The risk that future Fallout content will prioritize show continuity over game lore creates additional problems for narrative coherence and thematic consistency when television adaptations operate according to different creative priorities and practical constraints than interactive entertainment, leading to contradictions and inconsistencies that undermine the sense of living, breathing world where actions have consequences and choices matter across multiple installments and platforms. The establishment of show continuity as canonical authority over game lore would represent fundamental shift in how transmedia franchises operate, privileging passive media consumption over interactive participation in ways that reflect broader cultural trends toward the commodification of entertainment and the reduction of audience engagement from active participation to passive consumption of corporate-produced content that serves market demands rather than artistic vision or philosophical exploration. This shift would eliminate opportunities for future games to explore alternative interpretations of established characters, events, and themes in ways that reflected different creative visions or evolved understanding of the franchise's philosophical implications, reducing creative possibilities to simple elaboration of predetermined television narratives rather than genuine exploration of thematic potential that interactive media could uniquely provide through player agency and emergent storytelling possibilities. The concern that the show's popularity might not translate to understanding of the games reflects broader patterns in contemporary media consumption, where viral success often has little relationship to genuine engagement with substantive content, where audiences may respond enthusiastically to surface elements like visual design, celebrity casting, and production values, while remaining completely unaware of deeper themes and philosophical implications that made the source material culturally significant beyond its entertainment value. This superficial engagement creates false signals about audience preferences that may mislead content creators into believing that simplified approaches to complex themes represent successful adaptation rather than successful marketing of dumbed-down content that sacrifices intellectual sophistication for broader commercial appeal, without actually serving audience interests in meaningful entertainment that challenges assumptions and encourages genuine reflection about important questions. The potential for show interpretation to replace game lore in public consciousness becomes particularly troubling when considering how cultural memory operates through popular media representations that may bear little resemblance to original source material but become definitive versions in public. Understanding through their greater visibility, marketing budgets, and accessibility to audiences who lack time, interest, or resources to engage with more complex original versions that require greater investment of attention and intellectual effort. This replacement process eliminates opportunities for public engagement with sophisticated philosophical content that interactive media can uniquely provide, while also reducing cultural discourse about post-war survival, social organization, and moral choice to simplified television narratives that serve entertainment purposes rather than educational or philosophical functions that could contribute to genuine public understanding of complex issues that contemporary society faces in different but related forms. The risk extends beyond individual entertainment products to encompass broader questions about cultural production and intellectual development when market forces consistently reward simplification over sophistication, emotional manipulation over rational engagement, and passive consumption over active participation in ways that gradually reduce public capacity for dealing with complex moral and political questions that require sustained attention and genuine intellectual effort rather than immediate emotional gratification. Corporate success metrics that prioritize immediate financial returns over long-term cultural impact create systematic bias against content that serves educational, philosophical, or artistic purposes that may not translate directly into measurable economic outcomes, but contribute to cultural sophistication and intellectual development that benefits society in ways that cannot be captured through quarterly profit statements or audience engagement statistics. The prioritization of profits over artistic integrity reflects broader patterns in contemporary capitalism, where cultural production becomes subordinated to market demands in ways that eliminate space for genuine artistic experimentation, philosophical exploration, and intellectual challenge that might not appeal to mass audiences but serve important functions in maintaining cultural diversity and intellectual sophistication that democratic societies require for healthy public discourse about complex issues. This market-driven approach to cultural production creates systematic pressure against content that challenges audience assumptions, questions established beliefs, or requires genuine intellectual engagement with difficult questions that cannot be resolved through simple emotional responses or conventional moral formulas that provide comfort rather than genuine understanding of complex phenomena that affect individual and collective welfare in ways that require sophisticated analysis rather than simple emotional reaction. The importance of preserving Fallout's original vision and themes becomes more urgent when considering how few interactive entertainment franchises have achieved comparable philosophical sophistication while also maintaining commercial viability, creating rare opportunity for demonstrating how popular entertainment could serve educational and cultural functions that extend beyond simple pleasure and relaxation to include genuine intellectual development and moral education through interactive engagement with complex scenarios. The loss of this philosophical sophistication would eliminate one of interactive entertainment's most successful examples of how game design could serve serious cultural and educational purposes, while also providing engaging entertainment that attracted large audiences willing to invest significant time and attention in complex content that rewarded careful thinking and moral reasoning, rather than simply rapid reflexes or pattern recognition skills that most commercial games prioritized over intellectual development. The preservation of these themes requires conscious resistance to market pressures that consistently push content creation towards simplification, emotional manipulation, and passive consumption in ways that serve short-term commercial interests, while undermining long-term cultural and educational values that democratic societies need to maintain public capacity for engaging with complex political, moral, and social questions that require sophisticated analysis rather than simple emotional responses. This resistance becomes more difficult when commercial success of simplified adaptations provides apparent validation of market-driven approaches to content creation, while also creating competitive pressure for other franchises to adopt similar strategies that prioritize broad appeal over thematic depth, emotional satisfaction over intellectual challenge, and immediate gratification over sustained engagement with complex ideas that require time and effort to appreciate fully. The stakes extend beyond entertainment industry, concerns to encompass broader questions about cultural preservation and intellectual development when market forces consistently reward content that serves immediate commercial interests, rather than long-term educational and cultural functions that contribute to democratic discourse, critical thinking skills, and moral reasoning capabilities that citizens need for effective participation in complex societies, facing unprecedented challenges that require sophisticated understanding rather than simple emotional responses to complicated problems. And so we reach the end of our examination, fellow survivors of the atomic age. The wasteland that Amazon has shown us glitters with production values but lacks the soul that made us fall in love with this universe in the first place. Perhaps in our critique, we preserve something precious, the memory of what Fallout truly meant before corporate hands reshaped it for mass consumption. The games remain, unchanged by adaptation's failures, waiting for us to return to their irradiated embrace. Let these concerns drift away now, replaced by dreams of the true wasteland, where choices matter and war never changes, where the echoes of nuclear thunder carry real weight and consequence. Sleep peacefully, knowing that somewhere in the digital vaults of our computers, the real Fallout endures, untouched by the sanitizing light of mainstream television. The wasteland abides, eternal and uncompromising, in all its horrible and beautiful truth.